Welcome to the Simple Questions Podcast. I'm your host, Dylan Carnahan, and this episode is going to be a lot different than what you are all used to. This is the highlights of episodes 1 through 13, going from the beginning of the podcast all the way to where we are currently. We're going to look at where the podcast was at the time. We're going to talk a little bit about the artist and the guest for each episode. And then what we'll do is we'll play around a 10-minute highlight from that episode. What are you going to get out of this? Well, if you haven't been with the podcast since its beginning, you're going to be able to get introduced to information you've missed out on. And if you've been with the podcast for a while, you're going to get to relive some of those really awesome moments that we had with our guests. You'll get to re-listen to some of the music we've had featured, and you're going to learn a little bit about where the podcast was at the time the episode was recorded. With all of that said, let's go ahead and jump into episode 1, What Makes a Good Beer. Now, this is the first episode we had really put out, and it was all based upon who I knew at the time. And so, as a college student and baseball player, I was working at Red Crow Brewing Company in Olathe, Kansas. My sister's neighbor, Misty, and her husband, Chris, opened up a brewery in downtown Olathe, and I had gotten a job there, and I was looking for someone who to interview at the time, and I thought, a great person to talk to would be Chris Roberts. Chris Roberts, super knowledgeable gentleman, very into craft beer, and it was an interesting topic that I kind of wanted to learn more about myself, being someone that had worked at that craft brewery. And I thought, let's go ahead and interview Chris about craft beer, and he was excited to talk about it with someone, and he agreed. And for the artist of the episode, I had played baseball, as I had mentioned, at Avila University, and my teammate Brandon Williams, who goes by the stage name LiBBY, had released a single called Jump. And I had the idea, if I was going to put out an episode, I wanted to make it more Kansas City focused. I really wanted to bring the attention to Kansas City. And I thought, what better way to do that than to include, a musician or an artist from Kansas City. And so I, just asked Brandon if he would allow me to feature his new single, and he happily obliged. And with all of that said, I just went ahead, threw LiBBY's Jump on for the intro and outro, and talked down to Chris. And this is just as a highlight about Chris talking about kind of the brewing process from episode 1, What Makes a Good Beer.
She gave me what I wanted from the jump. Me what it was from the jump. She me what she want from the jump. That's why I stay. She told me what it was from the jump. She told me what it was from the jump. She told me what she want from the jump. Said,
we've talked a little bit, it was mentioned a little bit earlier about how you made your first batch, but what are kind of like the general steps to making beer?
So, like I said, it's pretty simple. So basically all we do is we add, and we have most of the stuff we have calculators and formulas to figure it out. But for us, we have, I have such a tight control or such a working knowledge of our system. So we traditionally will use X amount of grain, and I know with X amount of grain, I need X amount of water, and X amount of water, X amount of temperature. And so we have a lot of standardization we use. It just makes life easy for me. We have a starting gravity for some of our beers that we try to hit, and we may vary certain things on that. But so what we'll do is we'll mill the grain, and so we'll send it through, and it's not even really milling like in the traditional sense, it's just cracking it. So we take the grain, it's whole seed grain, we put it through a mill. It basically goes through some rollers, and it cracks it open, and it exposes the inside of the grain. So we take that grain, we put it into what's called a mash tun. Mash tun is just basically a big vessel with a grate in the bottom with small holes in it. And what that does is we steep those grains in the mash tun at a specific pH, a specific temperature for a specific amount of time, depending on what beer we want out of that. And so depending on what beer style we're making, it'll sit in there between 60 minutes, either 60, 90, or 120 minutes.
And that's not much variety right there. I mean, That's the timing.
Well, actually, that you get to a point where, as far as like the timing goes, like it's kind of starts dropping off exponentially. We have this sweet spot that we're trying to hit as far as time, and anything after that, like the returns,
diminishing returns,
essentially the diminishing returns. Yes, that's what I was trying to. So after a while, it starts dropping off. There's other things that we can do to boost those efficiencies, as far as just letting it sit in there longer. So we could actually add, amylase enzymes to it just to get more extract out.
So once you hit that sweet spot, whatever that is, 60 minutes, whatever, then what?
So what happens is when it goes through the mill. So it's funny, it's called a mill. Anyway, what it does is it basically smashes the grain, and the husks on the grain stay pretty much intact, but the inside is crumbled up and crushed. And so the funny thing is the husks of the grain are actually, once they become waterlogged, become heavier than the inside, and they fall to the bottom. And so they actually develop this natural filter bed. So after 90 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes is what we typically do. We go through a process called Vorlauf. And basically, it's a big fancy German word for take the crap off the bottom and put it on top.
Okay.
I don't know if that's the actual definition, but that's what we do. So we open the valve at the bottom. We have a pump attached to it. And what we'll do is we'll recirculate it, because when you do crush the grain, a little bit of like flour essentially is made. And that's to make its way to the bottom. And what we want to do is suck all the flour out and redeposit it on the top. And so what that's doing is those holes are making their way to the bottom where the grate is. And so it's acting as a filter bed. So it's like a natural process where the endosperm and whatnot are inside, and they're floating kind of towards the top. And all the holes are down at the bottom, and they act like a natural filter. And so you Vorlauf just to keep some of that grain out of the kettle. And so we'll do that for a little bit, and we'll check our temperature, we'll check our mash pH, make sure it's all in spec. Then we'll stop it, let it sit for a minute, and then we'll at that point we'll take it, instead of pumping it on top, we'll transfer it over into the kettle. So once we hook it to the kettle, we'll open the valves up, let it start flowing in naturally at first. At that point, what we're going to do is we're going to start sprinkling water over the top of the mash in the mash tun, and that's called sparging. And so it's kind of weird. It's all these words. So it's excuse me, let me back up. When we hook the mash tun to the kettle, that's called launching. So we're launching at this point, which is basically just draining from one kettle or one vessel to another.
Simple enough.
Yeah, and so that's launching. So then we'll start what's called sparging. And sparging is basically just sprinkling hot water on top of the mash. That works kind of like, you remember when you were a kid and you had those little things that were like oil and water mixed together? Yeah. Because the oil is lighter than the water. So essentially the same process. After the saccharification is what it's called, where those starches, the enzymes in the grain the enzymes that live on the grain naturally are activated by the hot water. They go to work on the starch in the grain, and they convert it from starch into sugar. And so the sugar is just like anything. It's just maltose, basically. It's heavier than the water. So as you sprinkle water on top of it, the water is lighter. It kind of resides on top, and it kind of acts like a plunger and helps to push it down.
To get that into the other tank.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of. It works just like almost essentially like a plunger is the best kind of analogy.
Just pushing it down to get into the other tank.
Yep. And so also what it's doing is, because of osmosis, you still have some sugar that's trapped in those grains. And so it's once you get to kind of homeostasis within the mash, you can't extract any more sugar out of the grain. Now, with this fresh water coming and sprinkled on top, that sugar can move from the grain into that sparge water, and then you get a little bit more extraction out of it. So you can kind of get as much without grabbing, basically wringing out all the water, all the sugar. Excuse me. It's just using osmosis
in your favor
to migrate from. Yes. And so we do that until the kettle is essentially full to where we need it to be, and then we shut everything off and drain it. The rest of it kind of goes down the drain. Turn on the kettle. Once we hit a certain level, turn it on. Boiling starts. Once the boiling starts, we add in, depending on what beer we're making, depends on how long we boil it, and then when we add hops. So for us, with our water profile, we typically like a beer that isn't really hoppy. So like Isabel is a beer. I'm sure you've served a
the Belgian blonde.
Yes. So it basically just gets what's called a bittering charge. So once it starts boiling, now there's little things in there. Once the boil starts on it, it goes for a little bit. We give it a bittering charge. That's just to balance out how much sugar is left in it after attenuation. So the beer doesn't taste like sugar water and beer. And then, so like our hoppy beers, we typically hit those in the whirlpool at the end. And so that we get extraction. We put a lot more. So for example,
is that bittering charge? That's the hops, right?
Yes. Okay. Yes. So we put, like I said, depending on what type of beer we're making, depends on when we put the hops in and how much hops we put in. So like Isabel, for example, is 30 IBUs, and that's international bittering unit. So that's just kind of a measurement of how bitter the beer is and how. And so it's 30 IBUs. We do, I think it's actually 30 ounces of our bittering hop at 60 minutes. So that will go into the beer. It'll be boiled for at least 60 minutes until we shut off the fire of the kettle and then let it steep for a minute. So like Francis, which is our pale ale, it's also 30 IBUs, but instead of getting just 30 ounces at the beginning, it all goes in at the very end at the whirlpool stage, and it gets, I have to look at my notes, it's between 4 and 5 pounds at the end. So you have to use almost twice as much to get the same amount of bitterness at the end versus the beginning, because it's called efficiencies, because it basically is extracting out more of that bitterness as it boils.
Once again, that timing is going to be important when you put that in. And you've mentioned whirlpool, so I'm assuming that's happening after you've boiled it. What's that kind of?
So whirlpool it's just a manner of separation. So we're throwing all these hops into the boil. So what happens is at the end of the boil, we shut off the fire. We let it kind of settle for a minute, because it's been at 212 degrees for at least an hour. At whirlpool, what we do is there's a port on there that will pull the wort out of the bottom of the kettle, and then it'll pump it right back into it, but it goes in at an angle. And what that does is it causes the entire mass in the kettle to spin in a circle. And as it's spinning in a circle, it's also kind of forming like an upside down tornado is the best way to explain it. And so we have all these processes that happen in the boil. So we have what's called the hot break, where all the proteins from the grain that are kind of viscous, when they boil, they basically come out of suspension essentially, and then they coagulate together. And so it kind of looks like egg drop soup.
Okay.
In the kettle. Like before the boil starts, you'll get all this foam at the top, kind of like on a regular beer, but it's kind of almost like a meringue.
Okay.
Because it's all protein and it's all this stuff that kind of floats to the top. And then once the boil starts, all of that kind of coagulates together and firms up. And then you can see it kind of just, it's like these big flocks of protein just floating around in the boil the whole time. So we obviously don't want that into the fermenter.
Yeah.
After the boil's over, like I said, we start this whirlpooling process, and we let it go for about 20 minutes. And then it spins, around in circles, and then like an upside down tornado. And what happens is everything kind of bunches up and drops to the bottom and middle of the boil kettle. And so at the end, once it rests for a while, what that allows us to do is siphon off as clean a wort as we can. And get it through the heat exchanger, which is what cools the beer down to like pitching temperature. Because we start at 212 degrees. We put it through the heat exchanger. We don't want the hops going through, and we don't want the hot break and the proteins going through it. It just gums it up. And so by spinning it in the whirlpool, it allows it to clump together in the middle, and then it all will form up. We use a couple processes, a couple ingredients that we throw in there that actually kind of act as almost like a magnet, essentially, and group everything together and fall down.
And you use the word wort, was it?
It's wort, W-O-R-T.
So that's the final product you're going to get from after the whirlpool stage and boiling and all that.
Yes. So wort is any sugar, water. It's anything that we create, minus the grain, before we add yeast to it. So legally, quote unquote, once we add yeast to it, it's beer at that point. Wort is the unspoiled sugar water that we're creating.
Okay. And so you've cooled this wort, and then I'm guessing you're gonna have to ferment it, right? So it goes into the fermenter, and then at that point we inoculate it with a yeast strain, depending on what type of beer it is.
We have several that we use. We have a couple house yeast, and then we have a couple like specialty yeast that we pull in every now and then. But yeah, so once you inoculate it with with your yeast, it's technically beer at that point, even if no fermentation has gone on. It's just weird U.S. government regulations. So depending on what yeast we use, we have a fermentation profile. Depending on X, we'll do Y. So like our IPA, for example, we started out at 65 degrees and then let it go there for about 2 days, and then we let it free rise up to about 71 degrees. At the point where it hits its terminal gravity, which we know just from experience will pull the yeast off the bottom of the cone, because our tanks are coned at the bottom. So we'll chill it down just a little bit, and that yeast will actually group together the same way, kind of similar way that it does in the boil kettle, and fall to the bottom. And we'll pull that off and we'll reuse it. And at this point, we'll actually add yeast, for our IPA, we'll add dry hops to the top of it, and then allow those to sit in there for, typically we do 3 to 4 days. Then with same thing, we'll let them fall to the bottom. We'll pull those off, chill the beer down to get any residual either hops or yeast to flocculate to the bottom of the cone. And then we'll pull that out, move it into what we call a bright tank. And then the bright tank is basically the same as the fermenter, except for their round bottom. And we have a stone in those that we inject CO2 into, and that's how we carbonate the beer. So it'll go into the cold room, or sometimes we can actually use our other fermenters if we're short on space. But then we'll inject CO2 into them, we'll carbonate them in the tank, and then once they hit a certain volume, typically it's like 2.3. So for every gallon of beer, I have 2.3 gallons of compressed CO2 dissolved into those.
Wow.
Put a special adapter onto the tank, and we'll put it into kegs, and then we'll put them online and sell them, or we'll give them to our distributor and they'll sell them to the market.
That's a wrap for episode 1's highlight. Let's move to episode 2. Should you own a gun? This episode started around the time that gun sales and ammunition sales had skyrocketed across the nation. And it was a topic that I really wanted to learn more about. And my brother, who's a former sheriff's deputy, pointed me in the direction of Lieutenant Tyson Kilby. Tyson Kilby is a lieutenant in the Johnson County Sheriff's Department. He has over 20 years of service. He even has his own firearms instruction company called Top Firearms Instruction, where he educates civilians on firearms, and he has written 2 books on firearms, and he also learned Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under Royce Gracie, who is one of the first UFC champions and is a UFC Hall of Famer. And the Gracie family, for those of you that don't know, more or less invented Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And Tyson had trained under the Gracies and teaches Gracie Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Tyson is a fountain of knowledge on personal defense, whether that be firearms or other defense measures that you could take. And he really fit the bill for someone to answer this question. For the artist of this episode, it came down to a couple things. And I was trying to find a genre of music, something that was kind of fitting for the episode. And it took me back to Mike Rooney. Mike was a former guitar teacher of mine, and he had a band previously called Faster Than Hell. And they had a song called Nothing to Lose. And I had promoted, and still on this episode, promote Mike's services for teaching guitar lessons. So you can contact Dylan Carnahan at simplequestionspodcast.com, and I will get you in touch with Mike Rooney, who is a fantastic guitar player and a great human being, someone that you would love to teach you the guitar. He's got the skills. He's a great person. And so went ahead and put this episode together. The crazy thing about this episode is this was done in person. Tyson and I could not meet virtually. We had some technical issues. So Tyson thankfully agreed to come over to my apartment at the time, and we recorded the episode. So there was a lot of last second throwing of clothes in the closet, but I think it turned out really well. We had a great conversation, and here is a highlight of Tyson and I talking about what a gun owner looks like and the teaching of firearm safety to children from episode 2, Should You Own a Gun? So you've talked about that you've trained, a numerous amount of people, in firearms, both in law enforcement and just civilians. Civilians in particular that come to you for training. What does the typical personal defense firearm owner look like?
I don't have a typical. I have a wide range. I mean, I have people who, especially this year, first-time gun owners, like, hey, I don't know anything about firearms. I'm now interested in it. I know nothing and I want to learn. So I guess if there's a typical, I would say that's the most common this year
Is
or
a
recently.
Beginner
Yes, is a very beginner. But I mean, I've had people running the gamut. It's like, hey, I just started competing. I'd like to get my scores better, or hey, I've grown up with I've grown up with shotguns and rifles, but I'm not too familiar with the handgun side of firearms. And now that I want to carry or maybe use a handgun for home defense, I want to learn that realm of it. A lot of ladies, crossover between teaching the women in power that I teach, and that is a lot of them have been like, oh, I'd like to learn firearms as well. So I've really run the gamut. Believe it or not, I've had a lot of law enforcement officers, whether retired or just still working, but they want to polish their skills. Yeah. So I've had many law enforcement officers that I've trained outside of work as well. So it's really run the gamut. But like I said, I'd re-emphasize that probably over the last year or so, I've had more first time new to guns completely come to me for training, which, like I talked about earlier, I love the people that are new to it because I get to start them straight like an open slate. You know what I mean?
So those people, those open slates, those new gun owners, when they come to you, what are some of the kind of reasons they give for wanting to own a firearm or in particular use it for self-defense purposes?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them have said, hey, the state of the world, I feel uncomfortable with the state of the world. I've never really thought about it, but now I want to defend myself. Some people have come to me because, maybe they have children or something like that. And like, I've got a family now, and if I am going to own a gun, I want to know firearm safety at the highest level. So I've had a myriad of reasons. But the biggest one has basically been personal safety in kind of a tumultuous world.
Okay. Is there ever, I know you kind of talked about kind of mindsets for why you should own a firearm in one of your books. And is there some mindsets that's not a good rationale to get a gun?
I'll put it this way. There are some people that, yes, to answer your question, yes, there are some people that do not have the correct mindset to own a gun. Now, I would submit that it certainly is everybody's right. And if they meet the legal qualification, it's definitely everybody's legal right. But obviously with that right comes a lot of responsibilities. And I would certainly say there's a lot of people that have not met those responsibilities. So to break the question down simply, are there some people that shouldn't own a gun? Yes. The answer is an emphatic yes. Now, that being said, I obviously support people's right, the people that want to do it properly, that want to train and take that responsibility seriously. Obviously, I support that, as much as I could.
Yeah. So it's you kind of brought this up earlier, and this is the epitome of clean slates. Yeah. So someone comes to you, like you said, that has children, and they want to be, cognizant of like them and firearms.
Sure.
So you teach children's classes.
Yes.
And I know to some people that might seem crazy, and others that's a necessity. I completely understand.
It does.
So kind of walk us through that.
Okay. Love to. What's funny is in 2015, I had not taught firearms safety to kids, not on any large level by any means, maybe on an individual level if a parent had asked or something, but not until 2015 did I really start doing the kids classes. And it was just one weekend of a concealed carry class that I talked to one of my co-instructors and great training partner, a good friend of mine, Dave. I said, hey, this weekend, why don't we do a kids handgun safety class in conjunction with the concealed carry class? And he's like, yeah, whatever. He went with anything. So we did it. And what was cool was one of my good friends now, Rebecca Schmoy, she at the time was, she's still a Million Moms Against Gun Control representative. And I think she was Kansas NRA as well. She came and she witnessed the class and she did a blog on it. Well, anyway, I just had a blast. I had been teaching jujitsu and self-defense to kids.
Okay.
And how I like to teach kids basically is to have 90% fun, 10% instruction, especially with the younger age group, because I want them to enjoy the experience and learn from it. So we did that. And the parents were pleased. The kids had a blast. And she wrote a wonderful blog. And kind of long story short, I know I talked about this. And if you remember, I even briefly talked about this in the book, how this went through. But that class kind of took off into a large, basically, part of my classes has been that. And a lot of people, firearms instructors from all over have come to me and done versions of that kids safety class, kids firearm safety class. So that's how it started.
Can you kind of attest to kind of what the curriculum is?
Exactly. Like and I'm glad you asked that, because I was wondering if I was droning on too long because I wanted to go there. So I'm glad that we were on the same wavelength right now. So here's the thing, and because this is something that a lot of people have questions about. Parents have questions, and like you said, like, isn't this crazy? They say, I get this a lot. Well, when do you teach kids about guns, and what do you teach them? And it's a very interesting question. And here's what I would submit. You teach kids about guns as early as you can, and I'm talking 3 years old, and stay with me here because some people think that's insane. Right. At 3 years old, you do not teach them sight alignment, sight picture, trigger control, or anything like that. At 3 years old, you teach them what a gun is. You tell them that, hey, in the future, when you're able to control it, I will teach you the mechanics of the gun. But more importantly, you give them an unquestionable order of operation. If they ever see a gun in an unsecured area where a parent isn't around or an instructor, and the reason, and obviously I go by a lot of entities, stop, don't touch, leave the area, tell an adult. But you don't want to, a lot of people have this philosophy of, I don't want them to know anything about guns. We're going to keep guns around. But there's a problem with that. There's a couple problems with that. Number one, America has 350 million plus guns. There are guns everywhere in America. And number two, aside from the amount of guns, kids are extremely curious. There's a certain amount of kids that die in firearms accidents every year, CDC statistics. And of the kids that are killed, many of them, a percentage, sometimes 30-40%, I believe, are 3 years old and under. Now, that's obviously not their fault. That's the fault of the gun owner. But if you can give kids an order of operation that they know, hey, it's a gun, stop, don't touch, leave the area, tell an adult, and you ingrain that in them so much to where they know it, they teach it back to others, you can develop positive habits better than, the curiosity of what is this, what's a gun? So that's why I think it's so important, even if you don't ever own a gun, even if you have no intention of teaching them about guns, to give them a strategy of what to do if they see a gun in a park, in a playground, at a friend's house or something like that.
So kind of ingratiating them with a level of awareness. Because they're going to be exposed to this in their environment.
They're going to be exposed to it. Teach them about it. Nip it in the bud right from the beginning so that they understand it's something to respect and they have an order of operation and they train it consistently. That's another key part of it. Some people think, I'll give them a gun safety class one time when they're 5 years old and now we'll never talk about the topic again. And I totally disagree with that. I think all skills, all knowledge to an extent is perishable. I'd like to teach them consistently so that this is something that becomes ingrained in them. So that's what I would say for everybody, whether you're a pro firearms or not firearms. Now, when it comes to actually teaching them about firearms, I truly recommend doing that. And here's for a couple of reasons. Number one is humans are curious. Kids are curious times a million. So if you say, I don't want you to deal with guns, then
I want to deal with guns.
They're probably gonna, exactly. I use this analogy all the time with parents. They're like, okay, listen, think about your kid. Okay, if you put a Mountain Dew middle of the table and you say, all right, young man or young lady, don't ever drink from this magical drink of mystery, and then you leave. What do you think they're going to do? Of course, the curiosity. But if you do this, and I've used this analogy before, and I think it works, is listen. This is a pop. This is a soda. It's not the best for you. It does taste sweet. I'll tell you what. I'll make you a deal. Of course, you can have some if you do your chores, eat your vegetables, and this sort of thing. And there's much more of a respect that's learned, and the curiosity isn't near as much. Now, it's not an exact analogy, but it does drive home the point of most kids, there's always exceptions, but most kids can be trusted and understand the respect level of, let me learn about it, let me satisfy my curiosity, and generally speaking, they will get it right. So then I say, if that's the case and you want them to learn it the right way, who do you want to teach them? And the answer is always going to be a qualified instructor, or obviously a parent who is very familiar with how to use firearms.
You want that level of credibility, especially when talking about such a potentially dangerous thing.
Satisfy their curiosity and teach them the right way. And at that point, there's different guns of different calibers. Children as young as 7, 8, 9 years old can handle a very low recoil gun. Think of like a 22 LR long rifle or something like that. Learn the fundamentals of marksmanship, learn firearm safety. That's the first thing. And be able to operate it, and then have a very healthy respect and foundation for firearms. And I think if the more widespread that is, the safer and better off we all are.
The collective.
Yep.
And so you've kind of brought up that you advise just anyone generate this level of awareness and understanding of firearms, regardless, say, if they were a gun owner.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of people ask me that, especially one of our pinnacle classes, the concealed carry class. And I get that question a lot. They're like, hey, I don't even own a gun. I'm not even sure if I want to own a gun. Is this class good for me? And my answer is yes, because you're going to come into that class. You don't have to have a gun. You don't have to carry. You don't have to get your license after that. But you're going to come into that class and you're going to learn firearm safety. You're going to learn about some of the tools and gear. You're going to learn the fundamentals. And you're going to learn about the law. So right there, even if you never carry, you've just spent some valuable time learning some things that could be very valuable to you.
So that is the end of episode 2's highlight. Let's go to episode 3. What tattoo should I get? This episode was a rather interesting. This was actually the first community generated question I had gotten. Someone had sent this in via the website simplequestionspodcast.com. And so the 2 questions prior were more or less just questions I was posing myself in order to gain traction. I hadn't quite nailed down the concept for the podcast overall yet. And so at that point, it was just asking Kansas City experts and professionals simple questions. And then I kind of shifted and pivoted it and gone asking Kansas City experts community generated questions. And this was the first question that had been submitted by someone that shall remain anonymous. And I went out of my way trying to figure out who should I get to talk about this, because I didn't really know anyone within the tattooing world, which is one of the great things about the podcast, because it forces me to get out of my social circle, my comfort zone. So I went ahead and was looking for local tattoo parlors. And while I was in downtown Kansas City, I just thought, I'll just go to the nearest one. And so I found Grim Tattoo. I just walked up there, and because of COVID, I couldn't actually come in. And so I knocked on the door, and someone came out, talked to me, and then Wes Grimm came out once I had requested talking to the owner. And boy, really interesting guy, 3rd generation tattoo artist and the owner of Grim Tattoo downtown. And we set up a time to come and shoot an interview. And so I scheduled a time out with him, and then came back to Grim Tattoo and went and set up my audio equipment in the back room of Wes Grimm's office. And that's how we did the interview. For the artist of this episode, it is Jack Summers, and it features his song American Ghosts, which is off of his 4 Years album. Jack Summers is a family friend, a childhood friend of mine. His father, Dave, and mine, we regularly, the 4 of us, would go out to Indianapolis and watch the Indy 500. So I've known Jack for a long time, since we were kids, and he had put out this awesome folk album. And so I had reached out to Jack, and he had allowed us to feature his song American Ghost. So I really recommend checking out Jack, as well as he has another album that he has recently released called No Longer and Not Yet. You put Jack Summers' folk song American Ghosts with Wes Grimm of Grimm Tattoo talking about his great-grandfather Burt Grimm and Wes's journey as a tattoo artist and the evolution of tattooing, and you get this highlight from episode 3, What Tattoo Should I Get?
We'll say goodbye to these American ghosts and help the ones that need it most. We'll exorcise our demons when they've all been diagnosed. We'll say goodbye to these American ghosts.
Can you tell me a little bit about how long Grimm Tattoo's been around and how it got started?
Well, my great-grandfather was born in 1900. And in 1916, he was 16 years old. He opened his first tattoo shop in Chicago on the Bowery, which was a part of town where they had quite a few tattoo shops, kind of rough part of town. And at 16, he put his name up on a sign and everything. And the story goes that his uncle came by and saw his name up there on a tattoo sign and tore the sign down, beat him up, and said that he was going to ruin the family's reputation. So then he changed his name. He started using a trade name, Burt Grimm. And that's kind of where Grimm Tattoo starts, right there. And so that was 1916.
So how does the shop move around from there?
Well, Burt opened that tattoo shop, and an interesting thing, the story he tells, is that he was open there for some time, a few months, and Buffalo Bill walked in one day with a big announcement and said, I heard that the best tattooer in Chicago was some kid named Burt Grimm. So he hired him for the Wild West show.
Really?
And so Burt worked for the Wild West show. But then, Buffalo Bill died that very next winter.
Really?
So that was the last Wild West show. And I believe the story is that from there he did lots of stuff. He was in the Army, he was in the Merchant Marines, he traveled with circus trains. That was a real popular way for tattooing to be done, was to travel with a circus train. Every circus had a tattooer.
Really?
Mm-hmm. And then, so 1926, he opened up a tattoo shop in St. Louis, and he was there till the 50s.
Huh.
And from there, he ended up in Long Beach, California. He's most known for his Long Beach work, because in Long Beach was the people that he tattooed there still have recent memories of being tattooed. Whereas the people that he tattooed in the 20s and 30s and 40s in St. Louis, most of those are not around.
Yeah, so he's kind of lives on through his work a little bit.
His later work, yeah, he had a long, long career. He died in 85, and he's supposedly still working. People would still come by his house and knock on his door and want him to tattoo him.
So what made his kind of tattooing, I guess, what drew people to him?
He had a really showman-like attitude, that I assumed that he learned working for circuses, carnivals, and he would sort of bark as he tattooed. He would give you a story of himself in a kind of dramatic way. So he'd be tattooing you, and all of a sudden he'd say, well, you might not know you're being tattooed right now by the best tattooer in the world. By golly, it's true. And if you don't believe it, look at this quote in this newspaper. It says right there that Burt Grimm's the greatest in the world. And so he would go on like that.
Really? So he had it was kind of the process of his tattooing had like a showmanship quality to it.
It did. And then the style that he developed was very simple, and it's been emulated quite a bit even up to today, to even people even copying his original designs, the Burt Grimm designs. They're iconic, and so he developed that really well too.
What would be some of kind of those designs?
It's well, like the heart with the teardrops coming out of it, the crying heart, and there's quite a few things like that.
So you mentioned earlier that like his Long Beach work in particular, what made that so special?
Well, it's a recent memory.
The significance.
The second part of his career, the people he tattooed in Long Beach are still alive. Most people he tattooed in St. Louis are not, because it was just so long ago.
Yeah.
So he's remembered his role on the West Coast. And another thing he's memorable for is because his tattoo shop was a sort of a central place for tattooing, and a lot of the West Coast really famous tattoo guys got a start there in that shop, and so it spreads out from there really wide.
So he had an influence upon those other people that tattooed there, and that kind of.
He had influence on a whole lot of new generation, very influential tattoo artists, and so he's remembered for that as well.
So, how does Wes come into the picture here? How do you fit in?
Well, he taught my grandfather to tattoo, and when my grandfather began tattooing, he assumed the name. He was bestowed the name Grimm, so he tattooed as a Grimm. But then he decided that he'd like to teach me to tattoo. Now, back when he decided that, tattooing wasn't cool. Like, nobody I went to high school with wanted a tattoo. And
really?
So, yeah, it was kind of, and I knew Grandpa tattooed my whole life, but so that was kind of a Grandpa thing, you know.
It was aged.
It was like playing checkers or something, like something I just don't care that much about. I had other things to do. I rode a motorcycle. I worked on a riverboat. Had all this other stuff going on. And Grandpa wanted me to come over and do Grandpa thing with him.
Yeah.
So my mom finally started bugging me. She said, well, why won't you go help your grandfather? Well, I've been helping grandfather since I was a little kid. You know, he'd always call me up to come help carry hay or build fences and stuff like that. And so when he wanted help, I started going over and just helping him. And then he started me drawing and painting designs. And I'd stand over his shoulder and watch him tattoo. That went on for a year or so. He tattooed mostly bikers. But back then, when I started in 1980, I actually started tattooing. In 1979 or so, I started hanging out. And back then, the only two people that got tattoos were sailors and bikers. And so great-grandpa, he worked on the West Coast, really near a sailor training center. And Grandpa tattooed bikers. He pulled a little trailer and he'd go to all these motorcycle events in the Midwest, which there were quite a few, swaps and rallies and races and things like that. And so that's what I did for a year. I just followed him around. And then in 1980, great-grandpa flew to Kansas City, and I was on a riverboat. I worked on a riverboat 30 days on, 30 days off, 30 days on, 30 days off. And I happened to be on the boat. Great-grandpa flew to Kansas City, and they opened a shop at 38th and Main, which was basically more a place to house all of our traveling tattoo stuff, you know.
Really?
Yeah, because it was all travel-oriented. Like all the tattoo designs were in hangars that you could deploy, basically, instead of individual like frames on the wall.
It's very mobile.
Yeah, so the whole thing was mobile, yeah. And so we opened up a little bitty shop there at 38th and Main. And then we were there for almost 20 years. Grandpa sold me the place after 3 or 4 years, and I continued operating it for almost 20 years.
So you kind of gained that exposure from your grandpa, kind of just watching him, traveling with him.
Mm-hmm, yeah, and that's a funny thing too. Great-grandpa tattooed the way he tattooed in the 40s. He kind of technical stuff, but he had one-piece springs with no capacitor on these old fossil machines of his. And so, and I started that way. He didn't use a spray bottle. He used a bucket and a sponge. And it sounds horrible, but they would change that every time. So it was always antiseptic, clean, warm, soapy water. And but no spray bottle. The first time I saw a guy use a spray bottle on a tattoo, I thought, that's genius. So I started the exact same way they did. I tattooed the way Grandpa did. He tattooed the way Bert did. We tattooed side by side. It was seamless. You couldn't tell the difference between any of us, because that's the way you did it. We used instead of an armrest, we used a foot block and a lap cloth. It was very archaic. big blue flame on your tattoo machine because there's no capacitor, and if you touch that thing, it'd shock you. So let's see what else. There was carbon stencils. I had never seen one of these purple stencil tattoo machine stencil makers. We used a carbon stencil that you scratched a piece of clear plastic and then you rub burnt bone in it into the cracks, and then you put a thin coat of Vaseline on and pressed it on real carefully. Now, if you touched that thing, it was gone.
Really? It was that fragile?
It's not like that permanent 3M purple paper stuff. Yeah, it was real fragile. If you touched it, it'd be gone. So it was a different, even method to tattoo. You'd have to start to line it. You'd have to start at the very bottom and carefully do the line as you went up so that you didn't erase the line with your elbow while you're doing the top part, you know.
Wow.
So even the method of doing it was like really archaic.
How have you kind of, I guess, changed as an artist?
Well, right away I started doing all that old stuff, and then right away after I became involved in tattooing, I started meeting other people that were doing it and seeing that this was the old way. And I picked up a lot of stuff. I started going to tattoo conventions. I went to a tattoo convention in Reno, Nevada, National Tattoo Club, I think in 1981 or 82. And so from there on, I started trying to emulate the new ways, you know, which was kind of a revolution going on because we suddenly started wearing gloves and being a lot more conscious of being safe.
Mm-hmm. So you had a revolution not only, you know, of the aesthetic of tattooing, but also, you know, like as you mentioned, the ways in which you
even the technology that we were using, because I started using capacitors and two-piece springs and the purple stencil machine. When I started tattooing in 1980, no private person had a copy machine.
Yeah.
No one did. I mean, if you saw a copy machine was at a big bank or something, and they were the size of a Buick.
Yeah.
You know, one person couldn't even pick up a copy machine. So it was several years into tattooing before you could even go down there and hit the button that says, you know, shrink it down 10%. Or whatever. Yeah. If you wanted to shrink it down 10%, you had to sit in front of it and draw it on a piece of paper. You know? Even the technology's changed quite a bit. Now with tattooing, anything that makes tattooing quicker makes it a little bit more affordable. And if you think back when they were doing it by hand before electricity, it might take all day to do one tattoo. Now when they started using an electric tattoo gun, you could do 10 tattoos in one day. So it's 10 times faster.
Yeah.
Well, that guy's going to make more money. He can actually lower his prices because he's working the same amount of time. He's working 8 hours. This guy's working 8 hours. This guy's doing 10 times as much. He could charge only twice as much and just squash this other guy.
You can also, you know,
so what it did is it made it available to everybody could afford it now because you could do 10 of them in a day, so you didn't have to charge, you know, so much. You could charge a little bit less on each one. So it made it affordable and it made it very popular. So once the electric machine made it go through sort of a revolution where everybody wanted to use it. And what did that was that the electric machine was faster. So anytime if you make tattooing faster, you're going to get more on your menu than the other guy. So like if you see everybody drawing on an iPad now, you say, oh, that's not the old way. You guys don't know how to draw because you're not drawing on paper anymore and all this stuff. But if it makes them faster, then you're going to get left in the dust. I don't care how much that you love the old way. Mm-hmm. If you're not as fast as what they're doing now, then you're going to get left behind. And in tattooing, if you put a stick in the mud and say, I'm not going any further than this, you're going to get left behind.
Yeah.
Let's move on to episode 4. What is financial literacy? The guest for this episode is Versi Lark. Versi is the former Chief Information Officer of DST Systems. He has an amazing story
about his background, and he recently was appointed by President Joe Biden to fill the regional administrator role for the Small Business Administration. I had come across Versi when I went to an etiquette dinner hosted at Avila. Now, at this etiquette dinner, it was just some basic etiquette stuff, but they had a guest speaker, and that was Versi. And I ended up winning his book, Make It Rain, which is a book about personal finance a couple months after the fact. And I read through it, and I decided to reach back out to Versi. And Versi ended up becoming a mentor of mine and give me a lot of great advice. And his advice as, you know, a tenured corporate business executive really helped me navigate this tumultuous time in the job market and ultimately helped me get a job. Prior to me getting a job, there was a question submitted relating to personal finance, and I thought, this is literally the perfect person to ask this to. For the artist, thematically, it fit perfectly. So, Getitrogers, or Aaron Rodgers, was a football player at Avila University, and he had released a song called Capstone. And Capstone is literally all about finance. It's all about money. That's what the song's about. And so it really was a match made right there. And so had put the podcast episode together. And here's Versi Lark talking about budgeting pitfalls, and savings. On episode 4, what is financial literacy?
I spot imposters, get them from around here. I'ma grow no matter the weather. I don't need no dirt and I don't need no ground here. She said I'm fly as a feather. Wish I would've took it better, cause I went and got my way though. Flex harder like my muscle done came up, yeah. Hit me in the late night, skip the day right. I might get that little tap. All these rings on my
One of the kind of things that you talk about in your book is budgeting. So can you kind of just simply answer, what is a budget, first off?
Sure. So always there's a saying that you hear, at least I heard a lot growing up, and that was, put your money where your mouth is. And so what a budget really is a way to understand where your money's going, and then make conscious decisions about where you want your money to go, and then document that. I call it the roadmap. In my book, I call it, it's your roadmap to financial success and whatever you need to do. It's no different than if you wanted to, if I wanted to lose weight, right? I have a goal, and then I had to figure out how I'm going to get there. And so here's the exercises or the diet changes or things I'm going to do to get there. A budget is simply that. It informs you of where you are, and then you project out where you want to be. And with that, you make conscious decisions about where you want your money to go. And so I think of a budget as nothing more than a roadmap. And if you follow that roadmap, the odds are higher that you're going to end up where you want to be versus not doing anything. So it's a way to identify issues, identify changes in behavior. And in behaviors, I mean spending behaviors. And once you know those, you make some conscious changes. And ideally, when those changes occur, you see the things you want to unfold in your personal financial life. So it's pretty simple. It's an important thing to do, but it's not the ultimate thing you want to do. Your budget is just a means to an end to help you understand where you are and monitor your progress, and ideally make the changes you need as you monitor your progress to achieve the goals you want financially. Similar to losing weight, right? If I want to lose weight, I'm going to exercise twice a week or 3 times a week. I'm going to eat less sugar. I'm going to drink more fluids. If that's my plan, that's what I'm going to do. If I want to be an NFL football player, guess what? There's certain things I'm going to do, and that's just the way it is. And think of a budget as no different than basically your exercise plan to really change your habits or improve your habits so that you get the outcomes you want.
So what are some things that you might include in that roadmap?
Sure, pretty straightforward. Starts with just understanding where you are. So basic budget in the book and in the things I communicate, there's really the major robbers of wealth are where are you spending money, I'll call it on conveniences. So understanding that, especially in today's world where you can go buy Starbucks, you can go order everything you want online and have it delivered to your house. And when you're doing that, typically you spend more than you probably would when you're using cash. And so understanding what you're spending your money on is important. So your housing, your transportation, whether it's a car or a bus or whatever, your food, your clothes, insurance if you have insurance, or if you're paying for it for yourself. And then really the one that kills people are the miscellaneous things: alcohol, restaurants, Uber Eats. Those kind of things are the things that I call wealth robbers, that really take away from people's ability to actually invest. And then obviously, how much are you spending in your investing? So there's probably those are 7 major categories. I think there are 10 in my book. Once you understand those expenses, then you've got to understand your income. How much income are you generating today, and where are those sources? And if you're not making enough money to pay for those expenses and invest, then you got to either reduce those expenses or find alternate sources of income. So early on, when I was coming up, I started to invest in real estate because, I was working for $26,000, $27,000 an hour. I knew I wanted to have more money at my discretion to invest. And so that was the reason I started to invest in real estate. So in the book, I talk about get a side hustle. And today, again, with the internet, you can have lots of side hustles, from blogging to editing to, setting up a little store, to really generate more income if indeed your expenses are exceeding your income level and your inability to invest. So get your expenses right. And then the last thing I do that I focus on is understanding where you want to be. And so with your goals, I say set goals. Don't just set a budget, but then set a goal and say, I want to reduce my expenses by X, and then identify in there which expenses to curtail or reduce. I want to increase my income by Y. Okay, well, I can increase my income by either investing over here or working more over here, or those kinds of things. And so make those 2 decisions so that you get your financial life in order, and then take some of that extra money and start investing. And as you do that, ideally, as your salary grows and your income grows and your expenses continue to reduce, you can invest more and more and more for whatever, whether it's school, retirement, taking a vacation, whatever it might be, but you've got more discretionary money to invest where you want it. That's to me the most important thing. And so I use this term called SIP, SIP. It's really focused on 3 things. What do I need to save? How much do I need to invest? Then what do I want to use to pay my bills? So SIP, save, invest, and pay your bills. And the idea is you get those in balance by really assessing your budget. And once you get those in balance, whatever balance means to you, then you're managing your financial future versus reacting and responding to your financial future. Okay.
So, you kind of talk a little bit about wealth robbers and how that can kind of detract from your goals. But as far as just as someone who's just created a budget for the first time, what are some kind of pitfalls people fall into?
Yeah. So first, what people try to do is, first thing they'll do it once, and then they'll never look at it again because they felt like it was too hard to do to really build that first budget. And what I tell people is pretty simple. The first one is always harder than the next one, right? Once you build your budget the first time, the next time you go into it a month later or 3 months later, you're just updating changes. And so once you've got it, it's easy to maintain. So the first thing is maintain your budget. The next thing, once you build it, maintain it. The next thing is don't think about the budget as an exercise. Think about it just like anything else. If I was going to drive from here to California, I'd have a roadmap. I'd have a map. I'd use Siri or Waze or somebody to say, how do I get from A to B? Think about your budget as that same thing. It's simply your map to get from A to B. And it's an exercise you do to make sure you're on track. So keep that in mind versus saying, oh God, I got to go do my budget. Then the next thing to do is make decisions. Once you look at the information, you will find areas for improvement. Like I guarantee you. Take the action, and when you take that action, monitor it, and so that when you see those successes, it kind of fuels you to actually go back and revisit your budget. If you don't revisit it or take the actions, you'll lose focus, or you lose the energy, or lose the excitement about doing it. And what I found is, once you see the money, and I'll use my son as an example, he and my daughter actually have gone through the exercise now that they're kind of coming out of college and are out of college for the first time. And both have found simple ways to actually improve, even with where they are in life, improve their spending and their habits. Both are starting to see their bank accounts rise. They're starting to see their investments rise. And they've kind of caught the fire, so to speak, about, man, this is not as hard as I think. Now, are they looking at their budget every week? No, you don't need to do that. Look at it, whatever frequency makes sense for you, every month, every quarter, or whatever, because you don't want to really deviate from your plan too often. And then just get after it. So the pitfalls is not maintaining it, not really using it and taking the actions after you see what you need to do to improve your financial future, and then coming back and sticking to it. Taking action is probably the most important.
So What would you say to someone that is, to really reel them in and, that hasn't had a budget before?
Sure.
What kind of advice would you give?
Yeah, I'd say go buy my book. Be candid, and so actually, I'm actually adding some things to my website, but basically create a simple budget. Don't create a 900 line budget to start out. Most people never need that. Right? Use those major categories similar to what I talked about that you can find in generally any place, and just capture that for the first time. Capture your overall expenses. How much am I spending on housing? You don't need to say I've got, rent, utility. Just add it all up and say, okay, here's my bills. Here's what it is. How much am I spending on my car? Gas, insurance, tire, all that kind of stuff. And just put in one line item. So it's easy to maintain and easy to track. As you get more and more things going on in your life, you can really flesh out more detail. But to start, keep it simple so that it's not an arduous exercise for you to do and maintain. And then the more you learn as you go through the cycle of doing it, then you'll say, then adding more detail makes sense for you, because you'll say, what, I really I need to look in my housing and see what else am I doing there, and then actually make some changes at a much lower level. But at the first few times, just start at the highest level and kind of work your expenses, work your income. Within about 30 minutes when I meet with people personally, we've got enough of their budget laid out to actually help them make decisions. And the decisions usually come from the same places for almost 90% of the people I meet. They're spending money on, in today's world, how much DoorDash are you getting? Well, I order 3 times a week. Okay, how many times do you go to Starbucks? Well, I go there twice a day. I mean, they all come down to generally the same things that most Americans are doing. And so within about 30 minutes, because I know where they're going to be, I just kind of guide them to those places. Well, you know what? I have student debt. My college loan is this. I mean, and some people in their 50s still have college loans, right? And so you generally, within about 30 minutes, you should have enough information to make those first decisions. And sometimes that means, in a lot of cases, there's a young lady that I met with, a friend of the family, met with her, and she has a side job. She's working part-time. And with that part-time job, she's paying off her credit cards. And she's been at it for about a year, and she's knocked down probably 50% of her credit card debt. An easy decision to make, and she's doing that. And that's all you need to do. And when you get to that point where you've knocked it down, you say, now I can take some of that money and invest it more for my future, or save it for my future. Just keep it simple. That's probably the other thing. Keep it simple. Finance is not as complicated as all these large books that people read make it. You don't need to know everything. You just need to know a few things. And those few things are what I try to distill in my book, so that people can take every person from every walk of life can find something, either in my book or on my website, to help them make some decisions to improve their lives.
Let's go to episode 5. What is being in the zone? This episode was recorded in the spring of my last year playing college baseball. And this episode was put together by one person, really, and it wasn't me. It was Daryl Cronk. Daryl Cronk was the head baseball coach at Avila University, and unfortunately, he passed away December 26th of 2021. Coach Cronk was someone that you really wanted in your corner. He was a great person. He was a mentor, friend, confidant. He was a supporter of mine, and so it's nice to revisit this episode and look at the impact he had on the podcast. I mean, this guy, besides the fact that he, helped me pursue a college degree through a scholarship and helped me fulfill my dream of being a college baseball player, he did stuff that, he didn't have to do. I mean, I talked about the podcast every so often, and he left a review. He was the first review ever left for Apple Podcasts. It's Coach Cronk saying some kind words, and he just went out of his way. Just a great character, lived his life in a way that I hope that myself and other teammates of mine can emulate. And at the time, the team was working with former Kansas City Royals shortstop and 1985 World Series champ Buddy Biancalana. Buddy was working with us using his program called Zone Motion. And Coach Cronk, I had approached him wanting to interview Buddy, and as he would always do, he, you know, it did me a favor. He did well by me, and he put me in a group chat with Buddy, this World Series champion, and, you know, introduced the two of us, and Buddy agreed, and we did the interview a couple weeks later. And for the artist for this episode, again, the artist is AJ Cronk. AJ Cronk, A Dark and Lonely World is the song that was featured on this episode. And if that last name sounds familiar, it's because it is. It's Daryl Cronk's cousin, AJ Cronk. Cronk, you know, on my behalf, I was looking for music, and he suggested his cousin. And so he put me in touch with them, and AJ agreed to feature his music on the episode. It's really hard to weigh Daryl Cronk's impact on my life as a whole, so here's a giant thank you to Daryl Cronk. In this highlight, you'll hear Buddy Biancalana talk about zone motion and the brain-body connection on episode 5, What is Being in the Zone?
The only light I've seen in days is peeking through a hole in my bedroom wall. Her last breath still haunts my mind. I tried to wash it out with alcohol. I have slept a week in days. Lord knows that all I do is try.
So how have you kind of gone about that at Zone Motion?
Well, what we've been able to do is figure out, you know, what happens in the brain when an athlete's playing their best. I was fortunate to meet a guy by the name of Stephen Yellen, and together we have figured out a lot of things about the brain-body connection. And so my work, the main essence of my work takes place on the field, but as you know, there's a lot of work we do off the field that's essential. As I've learned more about neuroscience and the brain-body connection and the neural pathways in the brain, you know, I figured out, you know, what's really, really essential to allow to give an athlete the best chance to really perform at a high level on a consistent basis. Because as humans, we're either strengthening or weakening neural pathways, you know, all the time, which is rather daunting, right, to think about that. But it's true, you know, and so ongoing practices to strengthen these neural pathways that allow an athlete to experience their sport as slowing down and not thinking, and fluid effortless motion and great timing is essential. So, you know, most of the initial, we call it nuts and bolts, takes place while an athlete's performing in practice or in a game. And then we have the ongoing support that is, again, essential to maintain those neural pathways and continue to strengthen them.
Yeah, it's rather unfortunate that, you know, they atrophy, right?
Yeah, you know, there are actually studies taking place now that they're showing that if you're not learning something new, you're actually forgetting what you already know. And so it's great having a podcast because you learn a lot of new things. So you're gonna remember what you already know, Dylan.
There you go, buddy.
So
can you kind of tell us kind of who's used this Zone Motion? Who have you been dealing with?
I've worked with a lot of professional athletes. I've worked with athletes in 13 professional sports. I've worked with, Scott McCarron is kind of a real poster boy for me. He's won 11 tournaments since we started working together. He did that in 4 years. Matt Cain of the Giants I worked with, Jeremy Affeldt, Barry Zito, Todd Wellmeyer, Jake Petrushka. Did work with the Chicago Bulls, Portland Trailblazers, and done work with KU's baseball team, Princeton, Michigan, Arizona. Race car drivers, Indy 500 drivers, and MotoGP drivers in Europe. And, so I'm really, I feel so blessed to be able to work in multiple sports because the zone experience is for the most part the same in sports. The kinetic chain, the angles, the proper angles of the specific sports have something to do with it. And a lot of people say, well, you teach the flow state. And I say, well, it's not really the flow state, it's the zone. It's a little bit different because the brain-body connection is a two-way street. And the processes of the mind affect the processes of the body, and the processes of the body affect the processes of the mind. So in a game like baseball and golf, the mechanics based on physics are essential, because if the brain senses some weakness in the body where the kinetic chain is broken, it's going to throw things off in the brain. And, you're just kind of hoping, and most athletes are just kind of hoping that they, can go out and perform their best. I like to share the anecdote that, a baseball hitter goes 4 for 4 and he goes home feeling great, had a great game, goes to bed, wakes up feeling great, had a great game. And the next day he goes to the ballpark and he says, all right, I got to make sure I put my right sock on before my left and my right cleat before my left cleat, and make sure I put my lucky t-shirt on, and going to go take my 10 off the tee, 10 front toss. And then I'm just going to hope that I can perform as well tonight as I did last night, without understanding what happened last night at the most fundamental level, which is the brain that took place to allow him to perform so well. And so, we have a real systematic way to teach someone how to access the origin of their emotion, which is the brain, and build in pathways. And it's not a substitute for anything that's being done right now, but it works very well in conjunction with someone who really understands, biomechanics, and can, we help integrate that. And it's tremendous for expediting development and minimizing soft tissue injuries while we maximize performance.
So you mentioned a lot about kind of the zone and kind of the body brain connection. So kind of how does that work? I know you've mentioned in our talks the autonomic nervous system, and kind of what's some of the science behind that connection, brain body?
Yeah. So the main process for fluid motion in the body is to access the alpha theta state, a quieter, deeper state, and then move the information that you're processing to what's called the cerebellum, part of the motor system, the back of the head, and not allow it to get interrupted by the intellect, the prefrontal cortex, right? And we, as athletes and people in general, we know that when we start to think a lot, it doesn't serve us in life, but when we're able just to react, then it's like, oh yeah, things are easier, whether you're doing anything. It doesn't matter what you're doing. And as it pertains to motion, accessing a deeper, quieter state and allowing signals to travel to the cerebellum uninterrupted by the prefrontal cortex allows all the muscles to fire synchronistically. And again, the kinetic chain has something to do with it. So that's the key. That's how fluid motion is produced in the body. That's how zone motion is produced. And then just strengthening those neural pathways and the brain-body connection, and identify, what else may be in the way that is keeping that athlete from being as successful as he can be.
So how does the kind of this zone compare like this whole process to, say, meditation? How does that compare?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's certainly similarities, right? Whatever, if you are putting your attention on, anything with strong intention, that could be considered a meditation. Whether you're walking down the street listening to birds sing, or, using a mantra meditation, or, whatever, watching a candle flame or whatever it may be. So there's certainly similarities that can help put the mind in a better state to function at a level that's more conducive for success in whatever we're doing. So
what this state, trying to achieve this zone, or as you mentioned, some people refer to it as like a flow state. What are kind of the benefits of being in that state of mind?
Wow, way more than I ever thought. Let me say that. When I started doing this, I knew that it was going to play a huge part in the sports, down the road, which it is. And so first of all, one benefit is increased performance, very quickly. We've seen amazing results. My first 11 or 12 professional and amateur pitchers saw an increase in strikeout to walk ratio of 59%, and an increase in or decrease in whip, walks and hits per innings pitched, of 28%. So we've seen, off the chart success. My first 4 professional baseball hitters, 3 of them were independent league hitters, and 1 AAA major leaguer, saw an average increase in batting average of 79 points each. And I was completely blown away by that, because I didn't really understand at the time what I was doing. I didn't understand the science behind it. I just kind of knew, oh, this works, and let's just kind of experiment with these guys. And, they had crazy success. And then I realized, oh, I'm teaching them how to access the origin of the motion, which is the brain. And so anytime you have access to the origin of anything, you then have a better chance for, to control what comes after it. If you have access to the origin of the foundation of the home, well, then you have a chance to have a strong third story. But if you're just careless with the origin of the foundation and you're just pouring, concrete wherever you want to pour it, well, the third story, the house is going to be a little shaky.
Yeah.
Well, it's the same thing in sports with motion. If you're not making the brain the priority, and I actually had some posts today on LinkedIn and Twitter, Ken Rosenthal, the great writer and broadcaster, I guess brought up the point that they're, just a bunch of hit by pitches this year. Hitters are getting hit, I guess, at record rates, I guess. I didn't read the article, I saw it. And, and I told him, I said, as long as the processes in the body are the priority for the pitcher, you're not going to be able to, throw hard and command like you want. The whole key is we do want to throw hard. We want to command the body, and to command the body, you've got to command the brain, and the brain's the operating system to the muscles. So, that's what we're after.
So can you kind of elaborate more on, someone that hasn't been in that state, kind of what it feels like?
Yeah. So what it feels like is that you feel like you have more time, that you're not rushing, that you're in the moment, and it's the experience of time that controls the muscles. Anytime our mind is in the future, we're not taking our full power in this very moment right now, and we're not going to function as well as we could in that next moment. And it doesn't mean that you're not taking, it doesn't mean you don't have intention for the next moment, but you're very, very present in this moment right now. And so things slow down, right? And the mind starts to become just relaxed. It's like, okay, you're willing to wait. I'm not impatient anymore. You're willing to have patience, and you're more interested in this moment than the next moment. So that's wonderful, and that's nice. When the mind starts to operate on that at that level, it's really beneficial in many ways. So, and you're not thinking as much. You'll have thoughts will come to you. I always say to clients, don't go looking for answers, but do put your mind in a state where the answer will come to you, right? And student athletes, if you're taking a test and you're just grinding and you're looking, some answer's not coming, don't force it, but be in a state where the answer will come to you.
Yeah, it can kind of exacerbate things a little bit, forcing that.
Exactly right. So that's another one of the benefits. And then and the motion as it pertains to sports is much more fluid and effortless. And zone motion it's a strong statement, but it's the truth, is the primary solution to the injury epidemic taking place in baseball right now with all the arm injuries. It's not the sole answer, right? I mean, there are a lot of things that go into producing fluid motion and keeping the body healthy, and there's strengthening and nutrition and a lot of factors. But as far as the missing link, when when the motion is in process, if the brain's not the priority, it creates a muscle imbalance, which will pull on ligaments and tendons.
So I just want to bring this up just for some of our listeners that may not be actually athletes. How could they use this process?
Yeah. So I've been doing some corporate work, and it's gone extremely well, because intention with detachment is really, really powerful, right? So knowing what you want is very important. But when we're able to detach from the outcome, it doesn't mean you're going to lose sight of the outcome you want. But when you're able to detach from the outcome, it reduces the fear, and there's going to be less resistance. So you can think about it as a salesperson who's trying to make a sale, and he's pitching his product. And I think we've all kind of felt where someone's starting to nudge a little too hard or kind of push, and they're trying to get you to buy, right? Well, it doesn't work very well. And it's like, whoa, this guy's pushing a little bit, I'm going to back off. So as far as can really help people in sales, and start to understand from a neurophysiological perspective, not an intellectual perspective, but from a neurophysiological perspective, how powerful detachment is in achieving your desired results. So it's intention with abstraction, as I like to say. And both are extremely important. And working, so the integration of that is the key.
Our next highlight is from episode 6, How Do You Make Someone Laugh? This was a podcast I had a lot of fun recording. The guest for this episode was David Nastor. David Nastor is a writer, podcaster, public speaker, and most importantly, a comedian. He spreads his message of you just have to laugh, where he talks about the healing power of laughter. David is a very accomplished comedian. He's performed with Eddie Murphy, Robin Williams, and Jay Leno. David has also interviewed a lot of people on his podcast, and he's even spoken on behalf of Southwest Airlines, the CIA, and Cerner, and the NFL, and Coca-Cola, as well as many others. This is a very accomplished individual, and for good reason. The artist for this podcast was Knock Need Sally, and the song is Sunday Afternoon. Knock Need Sally is a local band that I had, at this point, reached out via a Facebook group. There is a Facebook group called Kansas City Area Musicians, and it's about 8,000 members strong, and it's a great community. And this is something I had stumbled upon on Facebook and had joined and had been able to get Knock Need Sally to come on and be featured on the podcast. With all that said, here is David Nastor talking about you just have to laugh, formation and delivery of jokes on episode 6. How do you make someone laugh?
It's a naked rendezvous. Come to Tallyvoo. We be in Mafia.
So humor comes in because I know you're going to ask me this question, so I'm going to jump to it. I know you're going to ask me.
All right.
We talked about this, and the question is, how do you make things funny? How do you make things funny? People want to know that. And I've actually categorized it into 3 different ways: exaggeration, wordplay, or absurdity. You have to take something something comes in my brain that I go, wait a minute, that's odd. There's a joke to be made there. That's one of the first things I think. There's a joke to be made. And then, so I'll just walk you through it. I mean, I thought about this last night. So I'm driving and I find out in Pennsylvania, they invented this little whistle, this little contraption that goes on the front of a bumper of a car. And as you drive down the highway, the deers hear the whistle. It's a very high-pitched noise. And so the deers don't run in front of the cars and you shut them up because and they invented this because there were so many roadkill of deer on the side of the road that they wanted to stop this. Uh-huh. And I heard that, okay, so what you have to lay out in a comedy bit, Dylan, is there's the premise. A whistle that goes on the bumper of a car that as you drive down the highway, the wind goes through the whistle, creates a high-pitched noise so only the deers can hear and they don't run out in front. So then my mind starts working. Let's make that exaggeration. What about the dogs? There's dogs. Dogs respond to high pitch, but then I go, nah, that's and I would do the joke, which maybe messing up a few dogs every now and then. But I said, with that deer whistle, that there's deer in the middle. They're having deer meetings in the middle of the forest, and people around because they hear that and they're going, "Shut up! I can't sleep! Shut up!" And I said, the elders are calling a deer meeting, and go and say, "Okay, look, we need a sacrificial deer. We need a kamikaze deer to run in front of those cars and shut them up so we can get some sleep. Who's in? Who wants to go?" And I'll say to the audience, you think that's stupid, don't you? I said, have you ever seen a deer run out of the woods? They never run out of their woods. They always look like they're pushed. and then I exaggerate it on stage, and I act like and then I act like I'm pushed out on the highway and look around and go, and then act like I get run over. There's the bit. So what I did was I took the absurdity. Now, here's a funny thing about that too. Wait a minute. If the whistle's going down the highway and the deers can hear it, The deer's coming up ahead. They can't hear it. So why wouldn't they run in front of the cars? You see what I'm saying? So it doesn't make any sense, the whole thing. So then I'll make jokes about that. Now, even if you don't hunt, that's funny.
Yeah. So how do you get those premises? Is it just from, like you said, hearing, seeing, just something that comes to mind?
I'll hear something in my head. Okay. And they said, like they say, hunting's a sport. And I'll say this on stage, and guys and hunters will get mad at me. They'll boo me. And I'll say, hunting is not a sport. It's a stalk, a drop, and a kill. You don't hunt for the sport of it. You hunt to kill. I said, you sneak up on an animal and you shoot it. I said, isn't that like walking down the street and seeing a senior citizen wait at a bus stop, and you go up and smack him and knock him down, and then look at him and go, oh, didn't I tell you? We're boxing. So I will hear something that I will say, that a sport, what is betting? Betting is an agreed upon terms of two people betting on an undetermined outcome. And I went, that's not gambling, that's marriage. So what you do is you lay out the premise, you take the facts, and you flip the words around, and you add some absurdity to it, and you exaggerate it. If you look at any comic who does that, that's what they do. But you have to lay out the premise for the audience right up front so they get what you're talking about. They have to get it. Then what happens in the brain, the right side of the brain hears all the stuff. The left side puts together the incongruity of what you're talking about. It's a puzzle. And then you hope by the grace of God, they get it.
So that's how you structure the setup and kind of punchline. Right?
Yes. So there's a definite science to creating a joke, creating a punchline.
That methodology.
Yes. And then you also, after a while, when you do comedy, you have to get your own voice.
Okay. And what do you mean by that?
You have to go on stage and figure out, what do you have to say? What do you have to say that makes David Nastor's take on the world different than yours, than Dylan's? What's my take on the world? Then I have to create a rhythm. And this is something that you don't do. I didn't do this consciously. I have a natural rhythm the way I talk. I have a rhythm the way that I do things that are funny. Mm-hmm. And then I present it. And after a while, once the audience gets into my head, oh, that's the guy on stage, and they get into the rhythm I do it, they're with me.
They're in sync with you.
They're in sync. And so, but you have to remember, I started off here in Kansas City. I mean, you're talking right now to the very first street performer that ever performed in Kansas City. I went to the Country Club Plaza first, and they told me, if you ever come down here again and do this show and attract a crowd and interrupt traffic, we're going to arrest you. That's what they told me.
So how do you get from there to on stage? I mean, that seems
so what I did was, I really wanted, and at this time I was doing pantomime and clowning. That's how I started off.
Okay.
I was with a pantomime and clown troupe. And so I went, okay. I went up to the corner of Westport, right across from Kelly's in Westport Square. There was a store there, and there was a little place to do a show. And then I also played drums. So I brought drumsticks, and there's a mailbox right there. So I'm playing the mailbox like a drum, which I found out later was a felony. You can't do that.
Statute of limitations is long past. You're all right.
So you have to remember, at this time, there was a guy that I saw, that I got to be good buddies with. His name was Mark Weiner. That was really his name, Mark Weiner. And he was hysterical, and he was funny, and we hit it off really well. I met him in New York. And this was when Robin Williams first came out, when he did Mork and Mindy. And Robin had this crazy style that he did and did stuff. And I realized that's the style I had. So I would go in the corner of Westport Square, and I would juggle fire. I would climb the fire escape and do renditions of West Side Story, the musical. I would play the drums. I did all kinds of little pantomimes and did things to engage the audience. And I did a street show. And then after the street show, I passed the hat. And then I noticed across the street, Stanford and Sons had a restaurant, and they had a room upstairs. So I talked to a guy about about starting a comedy club, and I started the first comedy club at Stanford and Sons in 1980. And the whole point of this is, if you want to do something bad enough, you'll figure out how to do it. And I wanted to be an entertainer, and I started off as a pantomime and a clown because that's what got me money. I mean, they used to call me the chubby mime. They used to call me the fat mime because I got bulges in my body sticking out that's not skinny, that's not skinny, but I got all the work. People were hiring me because I was funny. And so, but then I made the transition. And then I also realized I went to the Edinburgh Festival in Scotland, performed there. And I did an exchange program in South America doing pantomime and clown. And I realized real quickly, you can't make any money of this in America. Nobody cares about pantomime or clowning. They're not going to go pay to see it, but they will pay to see stand-up comedy. So I was part of the big stand-up comedy boom in 1980 that started the whole comedy thing when there was no David Letterman show, when there was only Johnny Carson, and David Letterman just started, but there was no HBO, there was no Showtime, there was no cable television. I mean, internet, there wasn't even internet, man.
Yeah.
You had to pull over and use a payphone. And so, but I wanted it bad enough, Dylan. I figured out a way to do it. And so I did it. And that taught me, and I failed a lot. I mean, I did shows, it didn't work. And that made me think, okay, what can I go make that work and go get the audience? And so that's what you have to do. No matter what you're doing, whether you're a scientist, whether you're an artist, whether you're a teacher, whether you're anything, whether you're a stockbroker, you're going to fail certain places along the way. Hopefully many doctors don't. But you fail along the way, and then you figure it out. You figured out, okay, I got to do it. But I just had a natural tendency. I just think funny. I hear something and go, there's a joke to be made out of that.
Yeah, that's something special. So can you kind of tell us, like, your transition from kind of this street performing, until you get in kind of in the venue?
Yeah, so I started being a street performer, and then I moved into Stanford and Sons. And during this time, schools and people are starting to hire me to do performing. And then once I started Stanford and Sons, I started incorporating the pantomime and clowning in with the stand-up comedy. Then a guy heard about me for colleges. I did a college audition, and they have things, it's called the National Association of Campus Activities. So they would have conventions all over the country in certain areas, and they would hire for colleges. So then I started doing colleges. So I'm doing colleges, doing pantomime, clowning, and stand-up comedy. I'm doing all combined. And I mean, I'm getting shows. I remember I did a show in Oshkosh, Wisconsin at their Votech school. And I had to stand in front of a buffet where the kids are behind me going through a buffet. I had to stand in front on the other side where the people sat in the dining room and make them laugh for an hour. And half of the people sitting in the dining room were Asian who didn't speak English.
It's a tough crowd.
So, and plus, my pantomime, clowning, balloon animals, I just did crazy stuff. So there I am inside going, well, this is just a street show. I can do this.
Yeah.
Here's the audience. And so little by little, I figured it out. Then the Comedy Store in Los Angeles, Mitzi Shore asked me to be a paid regular. I was at the Comedy Store when Pauly Shore was 8 years old. So I made the transition that I wanted to go here, wanted to go there. Then I started working as a performer in Silver Dollar City as a street performer in the 80s. And then people hired me here. And when you're good because people keep hiring you. People hear about you and hire you. They hear, I heard about this. Can you do this? And so I'm getting calls. And then somebody said, you ever thought about public speaking? And I went, what do I don't know about public speaking. They said, well, what do you write about? I mean, what do you do? And then I remember I did a show like 1978 in Edgerton, Kansas. And it was at a church. And I have to perform in a church in Edgerton, Kansas. 2,500 people in the town. So I chose to do clowning, pantomime. And I got a guy randomly. I just picked a guy randomly because he was so tall. I thought, well, this will be funny. He's tall, I'm short, I'm 5'5". This guy was like 6'3", maybe taller. I get him on stage with me. I convince him. This is all through pantomime and clowning. I don't say a word. I convince him to get on a stick horse, ride it like a real horse, put a kazoo in his mouth, make sounds of a horse. I get on a unicycle, which I learned how to ride. I make sounds of a motorcycle, and we race around the church. First one across the pulpit got to pick up a spray bottle and spray the other one down with water. Of course, I let him win. Of course, I'm going to let him win. Because the joke is I get sprayed with water. That's the joke. Everybody loves that. People are laughing hard. Minister's laughing so hard he's crying. Just a great show. After the show, I'm walking out to my car, the parking lot, giving thanks. I always give thanks after I do a show. You know, thanks for helping us, getting me through this one. Sometimes I think that's why I do it. I just want to see if I can pull it off. And I know that's really a strong reason why I do it. And the guy that I had on stage, Dylan, he follows me to my car. This guy's standing behind me, excuse me, scared me to death. He goes, can I talk to you? I said, sure. And he goes, I want to thank you. And I put my hand out to shake him. He won't take my hand. He comes up to me, puts his hand on my shoulders and looks down at me and says, you don't understand. And I'm thinking, you're right. I don't understand. And he says, 3 months ago, I lost my baby boy. He died. And this is the first time that I've been able to laugh and have any joy in my life. Thank you for reminding me why you just have to laugh. And walks off. And I'm standing in this parking lot in Edgerton, Kansas, going, please, what was that? So, and something clicked in my brain where I went, you know, it wasn't me. I didn't take credit for that. There was something else that happened. And that is what got me on the journey of figuring out why you just have to laugh. My whole brand, my books, my premise is you just have to laugh. Or what that guy said to me. You just have to laugh. So then I got on the journey of how does laughter help us get through difficult times?
Yeah.
And then that got to be what I spoke about publicly. And all these people, I started getting story after story. You know how a woman came up to me one time and she said, I just heard you do your talk on humor. She said, you're right, you do have to laugh. She said, David, read my shirt. And the t-shirt read, of course, these are fake. My real ones tried to kill me. She had survived breast cancer. And she's wearing a t-shirt laughing about it.
Yeah.
And then she said, David, and she was from Texas. She goes, David, my sister Rowena, she got breast cancer too, David, and she had a mastectomy, and we went bowling afterwards. She just loves to bowl. We all like to bowl. We're just laughing, drinking beer, bowling, and she was nailing strike after strike after strike. And she came back and took a big gulp out of beer and put it down and said, you know what, gals? I'm going to go back to that doctor, have him lop the other one off, and I'm going pro. Now that's funny. That's funny. And it's a real story.
Yeah.
And those are the stories that I do. So after I started doing during my stand-up comedy, less clowning, more of those stories. Yeah. And I found out the more I told those stories, people connected.
They resonate.
Absolutely, because everybody goes through crap. Everybody goes through a tough time. Everybody. Illness, injury, and grief. We're never escaping those three.
So how do you talk about such a dark subject?
So that story I just told you about the guy in Edgerton, I do that every stand-up comedy show.
Really?
And I every stand-up comedy show I do that, and I do that show, and I do that, and they're getting laugh, and I tell them, I said, you're probably wondering, why would I tell you that story here? Why? You're on a vacation. And I said, folks, I'm going to tell you something you're never going to forget right now, what I learned from that. Humor is a vacation from the emotions that paralyze us. And they start clapping. This isn't a stand-up comedy show on a cruise ship. And they're clapping. And I say, tomorrow I'm doing a presentation here on You Just Have to Laugh. I'm going to get in that any deeper. And I said, and if you don't think you got problems, I said, I guarantee you all came here to get away from your problems, and you're going to go home and your problems are going to be at that front door going, I thought you would never come back. So what I do is I can get people in and I can get them out of it because I'm sincere and I know how to tell the story. For example, bring a little inside the story I just told you. How did I tell it to you? She kept rolling strike after strike after strike. She came back, sat down, started laughing with the girl, take a drink out of beer, put the glass down, plop. I just set you up for the punchline. Now you're ready to hear what she said and hit you the punchline and you start laughing. Everything that I've learned in stand-up comedy taught me how to tell that story that way. Pause, break, get you to laugh. That's how you tell a story and how you tell a joke. There is a science to doing it, and you just witnessed it.
It seems like, outside of like the formation, right, the methodology of like how you place them, it seems like.
Next episode is episode 7, What Are Human Rights? This episode was really a manhunt for someone that could answer this question, and it just so happened that we stumbled upon perhaps one of the most diverse and interesting individuals Kansas City has to offer, and that is our guest, Thomas Becker. Thomas Becker is a Harvard Law graduate, a Harvard Law professor who, in his free time, climbs mountains. He has summited Mount Everest. He also was in a band called My Beautiful Bodies that won Battle of the Bands and has performed with Smashing Pumpkins, Jane's Addiction, Eminem, and even opened up for Dave Chappelle. Thomas, crazy background, and he also is a human rights lawyer, and he's done a tremendous amount of work for the Bolivian people, overcoming the events of Black October, in which the Bolivian military staged a coup, and then the military opened fire on peaceful protesters, and they killed innocent civilians, women, children, included in the casualties of that peaceful protest. Thomas Becker has done a lot of human rights work across the globe, not only for Bolivia, but also indigenous people in India, as well as the disappearances of people in the Saharan desert. He's done a lot of work that has impacted a lot of lives, and he really is the perfect person to have come on and talk about the legality and the firsthand experiences of what are human rights. It was kind of nerve-wracking initially reaching out to Thomas Becker, because I realized shortly after scheduling out our interview, Thomas Becker does a lot of interviews for all sorts of publications, whether that be in Bolivia, in India, wherever he's at, he's constantly promoting kind of those human rights violations and speaking out. He was interviewed by Vice approximately 2 days before our interview was held, and so that was something that really was nerve-wracking for me, because I knew there would be that comparison effect going on, or at least I was projecting that in my own head. But really cool conversation. And for the artist of this episode, it was Alisa Jefferson and her song Democracy Stands, which is perfect for this episode. Alisa Jefferson is a very talented singer, songwriter, guitar player, and it was an absolute pleasure to feature her music on this episode. Here is Thomas Becker talking about what's included in human rights and really getting to the nitty-gritty, quantifying some of these things, because human rights can be somewhat nebulous of a concept, and so he really does a good job here on episode 7, What Are Human Rights?
to put victims through that, like a lot, if you think about it, like if something horrific happened, there was one of the plaintiffs we work with is their 8-year-old child was shot by sorry, I'm thinking in Spanish, francotirador, a sniper, by the military. And while the pregnant mom was there and like fell back on her, I mean, just really, vivid, horrible things that I'll never forget. But they don't get closure when you have to leave a case open for 15 years. You don't get to move on. You have to keep every day fighting for this. You have to go in and do declarations and depositions and have the other side say, no, you guys are, communist terrorists. I mean, obviously some guerrillas or whatever. An 8-year-old isn't, but just hear the most horrific things about you. That's a really hard space to be in for 15 years of your life. I mean, this is a really unique case. Most don't take this long. Since, like I said, it's the first ever against the living ex-president in the US. So it's been really unique and lots of appeals and all this boring legal stuff. But still, just, I think a lot of times you got to put out the fire before you can even address who started it,
Yeah.
It's a bad cliche, but statement, but yeah.
But true nonetheless. What I want to do now is kind of pivot a little bit away from you specifically, and let's kind of talk about just human rights in general here. And let's start off with what things are included in human rights.
I think the easiest way, because I'll be honest, like I have family members who are like, I have no idea what you do. Like human rights is like human resources. What, like, we don't get it. I think the easiest way to think of it is maybe like civil rights, but internationally, or very basic rights that the whole world has. So, I think a lot of countries, we don't have necessarily the crime of genocide in the United States. Genocide is a crime. So you look to like international laws or international bodies, because the whole world, in theory, agrees that genocide is bad, or crimes against humanity, or torture. These are all things that, the United States and most countries in the world have signed kind of these international accords or contracts, or again, I'm thinking in Spanish, acuerdos, but treaties, basically limiting what states can or can't do. So like I said, you can't torture, you can't go down to the plaza and gun down a bunch of people. That's illegal. So we have US laws, but we have these international laws that also protect everyone, theoretically, like Americans, Nigerians, Bolivians. And so human rights is basically like law to protect victims from egregious crimes. So it's like kind of like criminal-ish law, but also like civil rights law, because so often the victims of the abuses are minority groups or groups that have been targeted. So like a lot of civil rights law in the US is to protect people of color, particularly, when a lot of the laws blew up back in the 60s when blacks were treated as, in many ways, second-class citizens. It was to protect a targeted group. So basically human rights law is the same. It's to protect these kind of groups of people who are being targeted. That's a very kind of simplified version, but it's like an international law version of protecting victims.
I want to get into more specifically kind of where they come from. Before we get into that, you've brought up, genocide, right, as a, human rights violation. What are kind of some other, I guess, rights that people are afforded, or that should be?
Yeah. So I'm going to be a lawyer for 2 seconds and I'm going to bore you. So I apologize, but it's just kind of part of the game. But in human rights, there's kind of two types of rights. Basically, there's civil and political rights, and then there's social, economic, and cultural rights. So civil and political rights are, you can't arrest someone without due process. You can't just throw them in jail and let them just sit there indefinitely. So, a violation of that, I'll talk about, I mean, this happens all over the world. I'll try to bring up US examples so people, I think, maybe contextually can understand it better. People that were put in Guantanamo without ever facing trial. Some are still sitting in Guantanamo and never face trial. That's illegal, both in US law, really, honestly, but also international law. So you can't arrest somebody without letting them go to trial or letting them have access to a lawyer. Every criminal in the United States whether they're guilty or not, there are certain rules and you can't just avoid them. So that would be a civil and political right. The right to go out and protest, the right to free speech, the right to life, so you can't be gunned down. So those are those types. Economic, social, and cultural rights are more broader. Like it's harder to put you can put a finger on it, but they're just slightly harder to enforce. So everyone has the right to a clean environment or the right to food. So like it's harder to prosecute someone in a court. Those kinds of rights are the kind of things that states strive to do, you know? So for instance, like if the US, again, I'm making this US specific since we're basically talking to a US audience, but like if there were a lot of arguments on like pipelines or extracting oil, and a lot of people, the people opposed to it brought up US obligations to the environment. So it may not be this very specific, like I was thrown in jail without a lawyer and then tortured and like this very concrete thing. It's broader, and they bring up kind of legal obligations. The US, you shouldn't, you know, extract oil from here because it's polluting the area. So those are like social, economic, and cultural rights. They're more like, we aspire to do these things. Rather, it's more like it's more, well, we say positive rights. You need to do something good. You need to like make something better. Whereas civil and political rights are usually, you need to refrain from doing. You need to stop doing. So you need to stop torturing someone. You need to stop illegally detaining them, let them out. Usually environmental rights, though I gave an example, you need to stop polluting, but they're usually more, you should do a better job at polluting, making the better environment better. So you should fight to, I don't know, include more electric cars. Yeah. I'm not giving the best example. I mean, it's but very kind of vague. You aspire to do better things. So there's like this division. That's I'm done being very boring lawyer, but those are really what human rights are kind of divided into these two different types. And those are like, one are aspirational, kind of more positive rights. The others are stop doing this, stop committing genocide, stop gunning down people, stop throwing them in jail illegally.
Yeah.
Does that make sense, or did I completely confuse
you?
No,
you
can tell me if I confused you.
It sounds like, you know, one, there's a, you know, the legal political subsect. It sounds like it's more, these are inherent, do not violate them. And the kind of social rights are positive aspirations that are maybe the more intangible.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of,
you should be the professor now. I think should we switch roles? I can ask you.
You do wear a lot of hats, you know, if you need to hand one over, I can take care. But
perfect. Yeah. I mean, another example is like everyone should have the right to housing. Everyone should have the right to food. You know, it's like basic things of like humanity, like people shouldn't be suffering in the streets. But it's a very different thing when you say there shouldn't be homelessness. How do you address that is up for you know, like there's different ways to address that. There's different, it's, as you said, kind of more, it's less tangible. It's not like, okay, tomorrow this one thing will happen and that will resolve that. It's these kind of broader, more like fluid ideas that you want to work towards. Whereas you can say when someone's being tortured and like, you know, waterboarded in the moment, that is illegal. It must stop. So the civil and political rights are usually stop doing this. The others are like, because we all, I mean, left, right, center, nobody wants people suffering from like starving to death, you know? Nobody wants, whether you're Republican or Democrat, you know, poverty or like polluted rivers. It's just how do you address these things are different ways. And so it pushes obligations on nation states to kind of figure out ways to address those. And if they're not addressing them right, shifting and trying other ways. So I think you nailed it. It's intangible. It's not these like very specific, you can put your finger on it. It's more like these broad problems we need to address. I mean, there are exceptions to that, and I won't bore you with all the like legal nuances, but that's basically how human rights are divided, or at least kind of in the more traditional human rights paradigm.
Okay. And you kind of brought up there, you briefly like name drop city states, and that kind of brings up where do these human rights come from? You brought up like declaration, treaties, you know, is this society at large? Is the UN? Is it, you know, a specific country, I mean, you even bring up, United States is like, hey, human rights, love them, and then it's like, all right, Guantanamo.
Yes. So following World War II, basically most of the nations in the world sat down and created a set of laws to stop things like the Holocaust from happening again. And so I'm giving you the very condensed version because there's all sorts of different like international institutions and regional groups that the US is part of the Inter-American system. So there are a set of laws that work for South America, North America, all the countries in the Americas. Europe has its own laws. I mean, so there's specific, you can go small, which is like US law, to like regional, and there are regional laws that we're bound by. And then there's just kind of the big international laws. So I'll kind of talk more about the big international laws. And there are really, honestly, kind of what we were just talking about. There are two big covenants, one on civil ICCPR, the one covenant on civil and political rights, and one on economic, social, and cultural rights. Those are kind of the two big international treaties that people have signed on to and are bound by those laws. To make things more complicated, states can sign on and actually say we agree with these laws, but they can decline jurisdiction. So the United States, often what it does is it will say, I sign on, I believe in these laws, but we're not going to let some court judge us for it. So most nations actually do will ratify an agreement and allow, like in the Inter-American system I just brought up, there's an Inter-American court and you can be held accountable before this court. The US has said, we agree with these laws, but you're not going to ever let us, you're not going to hold us accountable, unfortunately. So a lot of times, like Bolivia can get brought before the court and can get punished and the victims can get justice there. If you and I are tortured here in the US, the court doesn't have jurisdiction over us. It won't be able to do anything about it. But the US is still bound by it. That's the kind of complicated thing.
Yeah. And I guess that brings up, laws are great and all, but without enforcement, it really is kind of empty. So, with your work obviously being one way to do this, kind of who upholds these rights?
Well, I'm going to say two things. One, I think, and this is why I, as a lawyer, try to jump outside being just a lawyer, or at least like a traditional lawyer, because I think really how you move things in the US, what's going to get somebody out. People have made the arguments on Guantanamo and why it's illegal. It's I think universally across the world, holding someone, detained without being able to see a lawyer or finally get, court. I mean, we in the US, we have a speedy trial, a law on speedy trials. It's avoided that. I think the whole world kind of agrees it's bad. I think most Americans agree it's bad. Really what's going to make the change is public pressure. And this is why doing human rights reports, talking to the press, interviewing the folks in Guantanamo who've been tortured and showing how they've suffered. That's what moves the needle. Then Congress steps up and says, okay, this is bad. We shouldn't be torturing people. So a lot of it's public pressure. So there's that's not a very strict enforcement mechanism, but really at the end of the day, that's how things move a lot of times. But there are avenues where, the US is part of other institutions and our own laws. A lot of times US law will incorporate international law into its law. The case that with the victims and others brought against the ex-president of Bolivia, he fled to the United States after massacring people. We brought a trial against him in the US. And we used international law that Congress has said, okay, we're bound to that law. And so US courts actually allow some of these cases in US courts. And what you do, and I won't bore you too much, but a lot of times when you bring an international case into US court, then you can pull in local crimes. So for instance, we brought a trial for extrajudicial killings, which means basically just murder. That's the international term for it. And crimes against humanity, which is murdering a lot of people, basically, are committing these widespread abuses. But then we were able to tack on US laws, which is wrongful death or negligence or these other things. So a lot of times, the U.S. allows there are certain crimes that are so egregious that we do have jurisdiction over, whether we've kind of signed on or not. But in this case, like Congress, U.S. has, even if it's signed on to a certain accord and said, but we don't recognize the jurisdiction, Congress in a lot of times has taken the laws from those and incorporated into U.S. laws. So they passed statutes saying, okay, we're going to allow these international laws, and you can bring cases for these international laws in the U.S. because we think, even though, you can't go to the Inter-American Court, we believe it's so bad to commit genocide. We don't want genocide, people who massacre people coming and living in the U.S. So there are certain statutes in the U.S. that allow this to happen. That's a very long-winded way of saying U.S. courts actually, you can litigate human rights cases in U.S. courts. They just use a different body of law, and then you bring in U.S. law and attach it onto it.
There's a couple things I want to digest there.
Next episode is episode 8. What does it take to be an Olympian? This was a little bit of a drought, if I remember correctly. Hadn't been able to get many questions, hadn't been able to get many guests on, and eventually stumbled upon a question about the Olympics and had kind of reframed it a little bit and had tried to get an Olympian on and ended up getting 2-time Olympian Mason Finley. Mason throws the discus. He had competed in the 2020 Tokyo Games, the 2016 Rio Games, and he's an All-American in shot put and discus at the University of Kansas. Mason is a friendly giant, just to put it simply. Very awesome talking to him. He went over kind of just the life of an Olympian with us and kind of getting a window into his life and how he prepares for the Olympics and competes in the Olympics, and everything that went into it. For the artist on this episode, it was actually a referral from Alisa Jefferson, and that was the band LiBBY and their song Wildfire, which was featured on this episode. And this is off of their album Holy Roller. And that had recently released at the time of this podcast episode coming out. And so it was really awesome to be part of spreading the message of LiBBY and their awesome, awesome music. You will hear in this highlight Mason Finley talk about getting ready for the Olympics, the pressure of it, and all the preparation that he took on episode 8. What does it take to be an Olympian?
How, as far as professionally speaking, how did you know you could become an Olympian? Kind of what was that moment?
Well, there's, with track and field, it's like numbers, distances, times, so you can see where you're at really pretty easily just by looking at the results. And then there's the Olympic standard to get into the meet, and that can be a time or a distance. And so in 2016, it was 65 meters. And I had hit that mark 3 times that season. So I was feeling pretty good that I could make the team. Not that I could, win, get a gold at the Olympics, but just to make it, was a really big deal in 16. And the difference just being experience, really, just going to these meets and perfecting the craft. And I think that, the Olympic trials, when I was able to actually like settle down and get the winning throw there, yeah, I don't know. It was a great feeling. Yeah, I don't know. Just the difference that it takes. I don't know. Like I said, I think you just grow up and you just get used to failing so many times that you finally, yeah, get it all to come together.
When you say settling, what are you kind of referring to?
Well, it's easy when you want to throw far. You want to give it everything you got and, blast it, but that never works in the disc. It doesn't like rigid or like violent movements. It has to be really smooth, really long. Um, as you know, being a thrower, it's got to all come through your hips. Your arms are just like kind of like a string. You can't have it tense, and it's hard because this is like a 5 pound implement, basically 4.4, and so and you're trying to throw it, like 220 feet. So it takes a lot of maturity to like go out there and like I'm going to do this based on the footwork, the movement, the technical aspects. But at the end of the day, distance is what wins. So um, you'll see a lot of people blasting it still, even adults.
It seems like the pressure of those events has to be immense.
Yeah, I would say like Olympic Games and World Championships, the pressure's pretty crazy because, especially with the Olympics, you get one in every 4 year or one time every 4 years, sometimes 5 years, and yeah, it just feels like uh, you put all this work into this one moment, and on top of that, it's like such a big deal. Like I'm used to like going through my whole year where it's like, you might have your family and friends come to the meets, and so going from like kind of almost feels like field day at, elementary school a lot of the year. And then all of a sudden you get like this giant stadium with like, typically there's fans. There wasn't any Tokyo, but, you know, I remember 16, the stadium was just almost shaking because they were doing the men's 100 at the same time. So Usain Bolt was there, and like, man, that stadium was packed. It was just a really, really cool experience.
Yeah, it sounds like it. What what other professional events had you competed in leading up to that point, these Olympic Games?
Oh, these Olympic Games, yeah. So 2016, I was made my first Olympic team. 2017, I was at World Championships and got the bronze medal. Let's see, 19, I was at World Championships in Doha, Qatar, and then yeah, this year it was Tokyo Olympics.
How do those other events compare to the Olympics?
World Championships is like the same competition as World or as Olympic Games. It's at least in track and field we do everything the same, and the only difference is the other sports aren't there, so it's just track. But it's the same competition. I don't know. A lot of us see like worlds and Olympic medals kind of being interchangeable. The only difference, worlds happens every 2 years, Olympics happens every 4.
Okay. Now, in preparation for these events, how much time did you spend training?
Oh, a lot. I mean, that's what I've been doing full time since 2017, I think, or 16 maybe. And so my schedule's pretty consistent throughout the year. We go 6-week cycles of a certain lift, plyometrics, and like technical practices. And so Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I lift in the afternoon. In the morning, I throw. And so we'll do different things like throw heavy discs, throw lighter discs, and throw different implements like a heavy shot put or med balls into the wall. So we'll change that up. And then Tuesday, Thursdays is drills in the morning, like footwork stuff, and then plyometrics in the afternoon. So like jumping, sprints, quick feet, things like that.
And how long, how many hours a day do you think that takes up?
I would say if I do like with everything like rehab, um, 2 practices a day, it can be between 4 and 6 hours a day usually.
Wow, that's a lot, and it sounds like you have different types of training that you do throughout that time.
Yeah, yeah. And so like right now we're taking this month off. Um, but then when we start back up, it'll be like really, really heavy weights and like kind of longer plyo sessions. And then by the end, like let's say world championships next year, by that time it'll be like um not looking to break down my body at championship time. And so like practices will be shorter. We're looking for quality over quantity. And yeah, so it's really nice when you get to that point because practice start being a little kinder.
Yeah, you're more focused on the outcome as opposed to the training.
Yeah. Yeah. So it is fun. I mean, if I had to do the same thing every day, it kind of feels the same thing, because it's just one move. It's not really like a game. It's just like you have to perform this almost dance kind of a thing. And yeah, so it's nice at least that the cycles and things change so I can, be like excited to be at practice.
Break up the monotony a little bit there.
Yeah, definitely.
For the uninitiated, what kind of weightlifting workouts are you doing?
It's your core lifts are pretty basic. Everybody does squat, bench, clean, snatch, the Olympic lifts. Um, then we get into some weird stuff like sports specific. We do deep flies, which is like we put the bench on like 2 boxes and get way up and let the whatever you're doing flies with like go all the way back behind you and up, just trying to keep flexibility. And that's what's tough too, being a big guy and having to like maintain some sort of flexibility. Um, and so we work on that stuff. There's like a lot of spinny stuff, as you can imagine, doing twists, like really getting your core strong so you can hold those positions. Um, and then, yeah, lifting wise, it's mainly just those 4 main lifts, and then a lot of like kind of almost like dancer lifts. Yeah.
Now, how much weight are we talking here? Like if we're talking like power clean or like back squat, how much are we talking here?
Let's see. In the back squat last year, I think I got somewhere around 650 pounds, which is pretty decent. There's a lot of like shot putters are like crazy strong, man. I don't know if you've seen any videos, but if you look up like Joe Kovacs and his squat videos, it's like I think this guy's done like 700 pounds for 10 reps. Like it's just yeah, it's pretty crazy. So a lot of big guys in my world, and yeah, lifting bigger weights than I.
That you'd mentioned kind of earlier, like those other lifts or exercises you do, kind of focusing on flexibility. How much of a challenge is it, like you mentioned, to maintain flexibility with someone with your stature and strength?
It's not too bad when you have. I've just set a lot of time aside to make sure I continuously work on that. Whether it just be like just certain stretches at the end of practices. And I mean, I've been doing it for, yeah, since like 2000, professionally since like 2015. So yeah, it's just something I've got to continuously work on. But yeah, I mean, I think naturally, just because of all the weights that I'm lifting, my body wants to be tight, but you just have to kind of combat against that.
Yeah. That what you mentioned plyometrics as well as a part of your training routine.
Hmm. Yeah. And so like that's usually the harder practices, big dude. And I don't run and jump very well. So I used to blow up the weight room really hard. Like I used to be really big actually when in college. I came into college at like 340, and I left college at like 440. So I got the freshman 400 or freshman 100 pounds, and yeah, so I was getting really big in the weight room, but I couldn't move. Like I couldn't spin very fast. It was very slow, very, very stiff. And so when we started doing more plyos and I got my jumps and sprints up and the body weight started coming back down, got down to like 330 pounds. So that was nice. Nice relief on my knees. And then that's where my distance started getting into where I could like compete against top athletes in the world, is when I started getting better at the stuff I sucked at. So
Yeah, what impact does weight have on an athlete?
it's everyone's kind of different, right? And so that's what one of the things I really love about the disc is, of course, I think I have like a 7'2" wingspan, and all of that stuff definitely helps. But you have to find your own speed, your own movement, that kind of gives your body every chance it has to throw far, I guess. And so I've seen guys that are like 6'2", I'm 6'8", but in the ring they are fast, like way faster than I could ever be, and so there's different things that your body will let you do or that you can do to get the maximum distance out, and everyone's got to figure that out for themselves. But that's one of the things I love about the disc.
It sounds like everyone has a different way to optimize themselves.
Yeah, because I hear, I was a theater major, so people are like, yeah, it's physics, and I was like, well, I don't know math, so but it is, I understand that. Yeah, it's physics, the height of the person, the weight, people keep saying like mass moves mass, and I was like, well, there is a point where your mass gets too big where it doesn't move itself anymore. So yeah, some of the stuff you got to figure out yourself.
What it becomes a little counterintuitive, right?
Yes, yeah, you went too big.
Yeah. What you talk about.
Next episode is episode 9. How do you start a podcast? And around this time, it came to my attention that there were other podcasts in Kansas City. And I honestly wasn't a huge podcast listener, but I had dabbled, and I decided to listen to what other podcasts Kansas City had to offer. And I stumbled upon Neandertalk podcast. And Neandertalk podcast is hosted and created by Ryan Westa. And Ryan Westa's podcast was coming off the heels of being voted best local podcast by Kansas City Magazine. And I went through and listened to his catalog of content, and it really it was entertaining. And so I reached out to Ryan and wanted to see if he would collaborate for an episode, and he agreed. And so this is a Kansas City podcaster collab, and I thought, what better topic to cover than how do you start a podcast? Ryan and I talked about, our beginnings and where we were at currently, and it was really fun to talk to another KC podcaster. For the artist for this episode, it was Jazlyn Epps, and you can find her on all platforms by simply searching Jazlyn. And I had met Jazlyn at Avila University. Shocker. Avila is home to apparently a lot of artists and a lot of talented artists. And Jazlyn, I had a class with her, and I believe it was staging history, which is a really interesting class. And Jazlyn is a R&B singer-songwriter, and I had featured Join Me by her. On this highlight, you will hear Ryan and I talk about finding your voice and just kind of the journey it is to become a podcaster. On episode 9, how do you start a podcast?
We can stop the time and just be, just I come alive in the nighttime. It's the right time to be free. Join me, 'cause I come alive in the nighttime. It's the right time to be free. Join me, join me.
You'll see him. He's a character. You know what I mean? He's a character.
How have things evolved from kind of that episode 1, episode 34 to your 160 around there?
Close to something like that, like 158 or something like that. How has it evolved?
Yeah.
Everything technically and all that stuff's been pretty much the same.
Okay.
But I've grown. As first you start finding your voice. It takes a while to, as funny as that sounds, to like find your voice, how to interact with people, how to use the mic, how to sound, I don't know, just be comfortable in front of a mic. I think that's what that means.
In terms of a technical aspect, or is this like personality?
Not personality, just getting comfortable talking on a microphone. Like, go take anybody off the street and say, hey, start a podcast and start talking in this microphone.
It's gonna be weird.
I mean, yeah, I mean, listen, I mean, so you have to, yeah, there is just, it's like doing anything. With practice, you become better at it, and talking's no different. And when you're talking to other people, I don't know, there's just, I don't know how else to put it. You guys got to find your voice. You got to get comfortable with being on a mic. A lot of people don't like their voice, you know, and you got to get comfortable with that too.
You know, you bring up the point, you can't take some average Joe off the street, you know, because you and I, we're crazy sophisticated, but you can't just take.
You might be. I'm not. No. It's called Neanderthal Podcast. I'm a Neanderthal. I'm just a dumb caveman. Far from sophisticated.
When you give someone a microphone, yeah, it is a little more complicated. I will say a trick that I used is I'm pretty big into video games.
Oh, nice. Me too.
When I play video games, I use the podcast mic.
Okay.
That gets me comfortable. You know, I'm like, hey, search and destroy Call of Duty.
Mm-hmm.
You know, third round, we're rushing B. And hey, you know, it kind of gets that nuance of talking in a microphone out of the way pretty quick if you do play.
That's a good point. Even then, take some of those gamers. I play with a lot of gamers. You want to hear some of those Xbox kids on here trying to get them in front of a mic for a while when they have to be, you know, talk to somebody.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, there's a muscle you got to learn. If you want to podcast, you have to want to podcast. And I think that kind of personality already has something in them that will allow them to get to that voice. Like if you want a podcast, you know you're going to have to get comfortable with your voice. So I think, I don't know where I'm going.
Yeah, I mean, if you have the desire to make a podcast, you inherently have some quality you'd hope that would help you with your podcast.
Yeah.
Now, it seems like you interview people quite a bit. Like that's the
I hate the word interview, but
converse.
It's not, because I'm not interviewing these people. I'm having them in and we're just kicking it and having long form conversation. Like I think an interview is more like having a certain amount of questions, or like just, I mean, for lack of a better word, I guess interview, but I don't like calling that. That's not what my podcast is. I have all kinds of people on that I'm interested in talking to, but I don't like calling it an interview, because that sounds like it's me asking all the questions. Like I'm going to ask you everything and then you're going to bounce and you're just going to answer them. That's not what I do. I want my guests to ask me questions. Like we get into talk, we'll tell stories. You know what I mean? It's just, I'll have comics on and we just get goofy. I'm getting drunk with other podcasters. Like it's just not an interview. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, it's more of that goes back to that like transaction we talked about kind of earlier. It's a little bit less straightforward than, hey, like set specific, more free.
And there's nothing, and I'm not disparaging people that do that type of podcast or style. Interviews are great. I like them, but it's just, I don't know. I'm just not built like that. My mind doesn't think like that. I don't know.
The people you have talked to, kind of, was that, like I said, like you've mentioned, was that kind of the catalyst? You're like, hey, I just want to kick it. I want to talk to so-and-so. And that's kind of the kernel, I guess you built everything around.
Yeah, for the most part. I want to talk to interesting people. I want to talk to smart people, funny people. I don't want to just talk to random people. And I think that's something that it's hard to get people interested in that sometimes if they just see let me say Brandon Pat. I got a picture of Brandon Patrick right here. He's a Kansas a stand-up comedian, hilarious.
Okay.
But if you see on like, oh, Brandon Patrick, or I have oh my gosh, or just whatever the names I have, they're not famous people. People don't know them, and they just think, oh, who is this person? But I get people that are really exceptional human beings, because I've been learning that, like, there's just a lot of exceptional human beings out there that a lot of people just don't know about because they're just not famous for whatever reason, or they're not good at marketing. Like, I think that's a lot of what comes with these people that are famous, is they're just good at marketing. You look at some of these podcasts that are getting these awards or nominated for awards, and it's like, it's all just marketing. It's like, how, like, I don't know. It's just, you gotta be good at certain different things to become somebody. I don't know. I went off on a couple different branches there. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. There is an aspect, like, you bring up marketing, like, it's true. Like, some people aren't necessarily familiar with how to market themselves using the internet.
Yeah, that's me. I don't know how to market at all. That's my biggest issue. I know how to podcast. I'm good at podcasting.
Yeah.
That's it. Anything else, pimping myself, marketing, I don't know how to do that.
So how do you find these people? How do you find them? I mean, because you're saying, like, hey, I don't know them based upon name recognition. So how are you coming across these people?
Usually, I would say a good 80% of them are probably from Instagram.
Really?
I just find really cool people on Instagram. I like what they're doing. Some is just music. I listen to a lot of local hip hop. I've always liked hip hop, and I've really fallen in love with the Kansas City music scene. And so I reach out to the people I like, the musicians I like, or topics like, I don't know. I was into cryotherapy for a while. So I was like, oh, I want to learn about this. So I found a cryotherapy guy. I just find things that I'm interested in. I'm interested in so many different things. Artists are really cool people. Like, if there's a cool mural, I'll see who did that, maybe talk to them. Well, I'm really drawing some blanks. I've had so many, it's hard to pinpoint.
Yeah.
Because I've had over 150 different guests. So it's hard to, I don't know, just my brain's racked right now. If I could look at my guests, like, oh yeah. Like, other podcasters are really fun. I don't know.
Yeah.
I just find, and then I found them on, like, so Bumble has, Bumble, the dating app.
Yeah. There's like a business or friends version. I know that.
Yep.
Yeah.
There's the Bumble business. I've gotten some off there.
How did you get it onto that? You're like,
on Bumble?
On Bumble business. How?
Come on now. Holler at your boy. Single, ready to mingle. Come on. Ladies out there, neandertalkpodcast@gmail.com. Neandertalk Pod on Instagram. Slide in these sweet DMs.
Yeah. That was good.
But yeah, so that's how it is.
Next episode is episode 10. What was the Pine Tar game? This was awesome. This was awesome. Now, for those of you that don't know, I have played baseball at Independence Community College in southeastern Kansas. And along my journey prior to getting to Avila, I ended up traveling quite a bit to Tulsa for pitching lessons, and I received lessons from George Frazier. George was a Colorado Rockies announcer at the time. He played 10 years in the big leagues, won a ring with the Twins in '87, and he played for the Yankees at the beginning of his career. Super funny guy, took a vested interest in me, and really helped me with my baseball abilities, and ultimately made the connection to get me a scholarship at Avila University. So there is a lot owed to George for his impact on my life. And I reached out to him because, well, George played in the Pine Tar game. George, after they halted the game after George Brett's, home run and subsequent being called out for having too much pine tar on his bat, they resumed the game later, and George Frazier was on the mound for the Yankees. He pitched in the resumption of the Pine Tar game. He was present for the beginning of it. He pitched and played in the resumption of it, and I'm like, this guy is the person to talk to about the Pine Tar game. So texted George after, he helped me out in what would have been 2016, in the spring of 2016, and have texted him ever so often and kept that relationship going, and reached out to him about a podcast episode, and he agreed. And so was fortunate enough to have him on and talk about the Pine Tar game. For the artist for this episode, it is the band Jakobins and their song Strange Weather Lovers. And boy, this is actually a former guitar teacher of mine way back in the day when I was in elementary school, and he ended up moving away. His name is Joe Bulens, and I'm friends with him on Facebook, and I scroll through, and if I recall, I see that he's put out this album, and I listened to it, and I'm like, I was taken back. It was really good, and I really fell in love with this song, so I rekindled the relationship, reached out to Joe and said, I gotta feature this, gotta feature you guys, the Jakobins, on this episode, and he obliged. And so here is a highlight from George Frazier and I talking about the Pine Tar game and just going through the whole shebang and bang, and it's really interesting. And this happened on episode 10. What was the Pine Tar game?
All the different fights that went on. Nettles and Brett at third base had a big fight one year. I think George popped up and gave him a shoulder. Nettles popped him, and the fight was on. Yeah, there was always that intense rivalry for the games. But it was like playing college football on a Saturday afternoon in front of 100,000 people. It was that way every game, and that's what made it fun for me. I loved it. I loved warming up down the left field line in that little tunnel. It sounded like you're throwing 180 miles an hour. I mean, it's great. The loud pops, bands throwing beer on you over the top of it and everything. That just initiated more fire for us, and it created more. But I don't think Yankee fans truly mistreated the Royals of the way the Royals fans didn't like the Yankees. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that was pretty crazy.
And what do you mean when you say that? What makes you say that?
Well, Yankee fans are Yankee fans, but they're also very appreciative of the game. They're appreciative of good players. We get a bunt over, they're going to stand up and clap. Not necessarily. They did when I played. The Midwest fans were always good. Don't get me wrong. Royals fans and Cardinal fans were always good fans. But there always is that dislike for certain people. Certain teams. And I think because of the rivalry, it's like playing Kansas State, Oklahoma State, Nebraska, Oklahoma. There was always that rivalry of everything. So, and I think that's where, they yell names at you and try to distract you as you're warming up while you're going out to try to do your job at times. And a lot of Yankee fans lived in Kansas City too. So, I mean, we get a lot of that when we were there.
Can you talk a little bit about that series that ultimately ended up with that controversial Pine Tar game? What was that series like leading up to that?
Well, it was that was an afternoon game. Goose came in to pitch, but I'd have to go back and look, to be honest with you, to remember how the series was going. But it was an intense series because it was late. It was like, I can't remember, June or July that we played the game. So, and then we had to come back and play the suspended part of the game later on. But you know how it all happened and how they got caught was you can't have pine tar past the width of home plate. And so Greg Nettles had said something to Billy. And then when he did hit the home run, Billy went up to him and said, get the bat measured. It can't be any wider than home plate. And sure enough, it was from the handle past that grip area. So it was all the way up past the label on the bat. And that's actually that's what the rule states. But then they came back and said pine tar had no effect on the flight of the ball and all that kind of stuff. Yet they say now that pine tar has all the difference in being able to throw a baseball where you need to.
How knowledgeable were players about that rule at that time?
Oh, they didn't know anything about it. I think Nettles probably pulled that one out of the hat. Billy had somebody look it up, and then he made that decision to go ahead and create that. So yeah, I don't think anybody was right on top of that going into it.
So that was something that was brought to Billy Martin's attention. And at what point was that, in the series or that particular game?
Well, I think it was during the series. And, because Brett liked a lot of pine tar on his bat. You go back and look at him. He never hit with gloves. So he would always have pine tar over his bat so he could grip the glove a little better or bat a little better. And I think somebody said something to him during the series. So they're waiting to see, if George Brett does something to beat us in the ball game, we're going to bring it to everybody's attention. And he hit the home run off Goose, high fastball at 98 miles an hour, hit it in third deck. And next thing you know, we're in a little bit of a mess, or they are. Tim McClellan was the home plate umpire. And that guy's like 6'7", 250 pounds. And George couldn't shove him around, but he sure was trying.
Yeah. And how did the players and fans react when, George was called out?
Oh, the Yankee fans loved it, of course. They were excited for it. That he was called out. The Yankees are going to win the game. So they were extremely excited. I don't think anybody anticipated the turnaround or the change the way it ended up happening, because they just basically changed everything for everybody. Because now you're going to have to come back and play the game again. I had to get the out, and I think we went 3 up, 3 down, and the game was over. So it was a quick result and a quick end on a Monday afternoon.
In the days after, that decision was made, that Brett was out, what was the media attention like?
Oh, it wasn't as much as you would think it was. I mean, it kind of died down after a couple of days. After they went, okay, who told you this? Who told you that? Of course, Billy never revealed any of it to anybody. How'd this happen? How'd that happen? Not anything about it. Then a ruling came out that we were going to have to play the game, finish the game. So as soon as that happened, they okay, all right. And then we just waited for a date to be assigned by the league, and then we played that game out.
How did the clubhouse view the decision being overturned?
Oh, I mean, they were just like, all right, well, let's go play the game. At the time, this is June or July, and we're playing it August. I think August 10th was the replay of the thing. So nobody really cared. I mean, we didn't even really think about it until that time when it was time to play the game again. And quite honestly, I think at that point we were 1 or 2 back of Baltimore at the time, and Kansas City was leading their division. And we honestly, we probably didn't think a whole lot about it. That was a long time ago. That's 40 years ago.
I know there was kind of some legal, grumblings about replaying the game. How certain of you were you that you were going to play that day?
Well, I think when the league came out and said, eventually at one point they said, no, we're not going to replay the game. Then they came out and upheld the appeal. And the thing was, we weren't going to replay the whole game. We were just going to replay the third out of the inning. in the top of the ninth, and then for us to hit in the bottom of the ninth and go forward. And so that's kind of what, what they had said. So really wasn't any a whole lot of legality to it. I mean, Steinbrenner fought it a little bit, but once the league said, no, you're playing, that was kind of the end of it.
And going into that, resuming that game, you had mentioned kind of how the lineup was a little wonky. What was the rationale for having a starting lineup like that?
Because what happened, Omar Marino was out of the game, so we had to have a center fielder, and Guidry's probably the best center fielder we had anyway. So Guidry was the center fielder. We had to move a guy over to first because guys had been pinch hit for, other guys had gotten hurt. They weren't on the score because you had to go by the scorecard from when the game was suspended to replay the game. So there was guys that had pitched the day before, couldn't pitch. There was guys that had played 7, 8, 10 days in a row, needed an off day. And quite honestly, Billy thought it was kind of a farce. We even had to play the game. So that's why he put the lineup together that way.
You're saying it kind of the culmination of Billy seeing it as a farce, in addition to you had to play that roster from that game.
Right. So it was just, it was kind of one of those deals. I don't think Martin really wanted to play the game. Quite honestly, I don't think he wanted anything to do with it. Then as it turned out, he ended up, we had to play the game, and it was like, all right, well, you guys making a mockery out of this, I'm going to make one out of it. And that's kind of what he did.
Yeah. And what, you're on the mound for the Yankees when they resumed that game. What were you told before you went out?
Well, they just told me to go get an out. I mean, I was actually in the bullpen, and me and one other guy, I think it was David LaRoche, were the only ones left that were eligible to pitch in the game. Everybody up, because you got to go off the previous scorecard. And so the two of us were the only ones that had been eligible, and I hadn't pitched for a couple of days. So Billy just came in and said, hey, you're going to start the ball game, pitch the ninth. I said, okay. And that was kind of the end of it. And I just went down to the bullpen and got loose, and then came in and started again. So there was no national anthem. There was none of that because we'd already had all of that. So it's just the continuation of that ninth inning.
Really? So it was really just like you said, a continuation. There's none of that showmanship that you get at the beginning of a baseball game.
No. So, everybody just kind of jogged out to positions. I got loose through my 8 warm-ups, threw 3 to McCray, struck him out. And I think we came in and went 1, 2, 3 actually, and the game was over and everybody went home. So a game that started at 2, I think it was over by 2:30 and everybody was on their way.
Wow.
They bussed over from Baltimore. So they were taking the bus back or train back to Baltimore because they had to play in Baltimore on Tuesday in August. So they just came up for that one deal and then turned around and went right back.
Interesting. That was super brief. When you went out there, George, I recall you throwing 2 throws, 1 to first and 1 to second.
Well, that's where Billy had us appeal that they didn't touch the base. And so the reason behind that, Martin knew that umpiring crew had not seen George Brett touch the bases. So he had me appeal first. They called him safe. Had me appeal second, called him safe. Billy came out, said, you never saw him touch the base. And the umpire pulled out an affidavit out of his back pocket. So I think somebody had tipped the umpires, or maybe they just felt like what Billy was going to do. And, or somebody called and said, are we going to have the same umpire crew too? No, you got a new umpire crew. And that's where Billy thought, oh, well, then I'll just go out and appeal it because they didn't see him touch the base. When in reality, he already had, the umpires already had a affidavit stating that they had saw him touch the base.
How odd is that?
Well, I mean, it's just, who would think it all, to be honest with you. I wouldn't have who would ever think of all that stuff?
Yeah. Now you kind of mentioned how, that last inning wrapped up, it was pretty brief. You go in there, you get the strikeout, and then, bottom of the inning, it goes 1, 2, 3. How much of an impact did that game have on the rest of your season? Was it just hey, that was just
nothing? Not really. I mean, we kind of got back into the hunt in late September, and if I remember right correctly, Baltimore won it in '83. They had 4 really good starting pitchers, so they ended up winning the American League East, American League East at the time, because there was just an East and a West. There wasn't a Central at the time. So they won the division. They went on to win the World Series, if I'm not mistaken, in '83. So that game had no effect on us going down the road. You can always look back to a season and say, well, man, if we'd have won these 2 games, or how'd we ever lose to Cleveland? Should never lost to them. We should never lost to this team. But you can't do that. You go back and you start trying to recount the whole season, and did one game have an effect on the season? I don't think that game had an effect on us.
When you look back kind of on your baseball career, what do you think of the Pine Tar game?
Well, just part of history. A strange game, strange history, strange part of the game, all the above. So, yeah, I mean, at the time it was just nuts. People today, still today, from New York Times, New York Post, Daily News, about every 3 or 4 years they'll call and, hey, you want to talk about the Pine Tar game? And I go, not really, but I will if you need to. So, we talk about it. Somebody brings it up.
Next episode was episode 11, How Will We Live in the Future? Now, around this time, I was looking for a job. I was nearing graduation, and I had reached out to a lot of different people to live vicariously through them and see, what kind of profession I wanted to go into, albeit it was a little fourth quarter there. But I had reached out to a lot of different entrepreneurs, and one of them was Blake Miller. Blake Miller was the CEO and founder of Homebase, which is a smart living experience company that allows property owners and residents access to the Internet of Things through smart access, device automation, community Wi-Fi, and digital payments. And so Blake had worked on the Kansas City Smart City initiative, which basically created smart infrastructure in Kansas City through public Wi-Fi, and he actually received an Edison Award for that. And Blake is an entrepreneur, and he had worked at a startup incubator, so I had reached out to him via LinkedIn, and he's like, yeah, let's go grab a coffee and talk about what it's like to be an entrepreneur, which is super crazy, because here I am talking to this guy who received millions of dollars worth of investment in his company, and he's agreeing to just sit down and talk about his experiences. And I was super stoked, and I had met with Blake several times. We met at Messenger Coffee, and we would just talk about what it's like to be an entrepreneur, and I would come with questions, and he would give really great in-depth answers, and I learned a lot from Blake. And I decided, hey, let's have Blake on the pod, and let's talk about how we will live in the future. He's got this great company. He's got all this experience. What better person to have on? For the artist for this episode, it was WHiTMiRE. Now, WhitMire I had met through that Kansas City musicians Facebook group, and he has his own, WhiTMiRE has his own label called Spooky Kitten Records, and he put out this song called The Otherside, which you can find on Apple and Spotify. And man, he's got a lot of music. He was putting out like a song a week for all of 2021, and he was doing all different kinds of genres. A lot of cool stuff that he's up to. So I'd highly recommend checking out his music and his record label and all of the artists under that label. In this highlight, Blake and I talk about what does Homebase do, the Internet of Things, and really kind of give a better explanation to kind of some of these more complex themes and trends that we're seeing within our environment that are going to impact the way we live in the future, which is what we're talking about on episode 11. How will we live in the future?
Every one of those had, many evolutions inside of each one of those kind of phases of my journey.
Can you tell us more about the KC Smart City Initiative and what you all did on that project?
Sure. So that was a really unique opportunity that came to us because of the business incubator that we were running called Think Big. And so we had a group from Cisco that came to us after Kansas City had gotten Google Fiber. We had a streetcar that was under development in Kansas City, and really a thriving and growing entrepreneurial ecosystem. And Cisco saw the opportunity to do a branded incubator, a smart city incubator, looking for new technologies that cities could deploy to help make their cities smart. And instead of just doing an incubator, I kind of thought of the idea to approach the mayor and do what we ended up calling the Living Lab, which was deploying a public Wi-Fi network along the streetcar, which is a 2.2-mile stretch. It's one of the world's largest public Wi-Fi networks to date. We deployed smart streetlights, digital kiosks, environmental sensors, and we took all this infrastructure and used the analogy of turning the city into a smartphone. We have all these sensors, we have connectivity, and data. And what if we open that up and open that infrastructure up and allowed people to build apps on top of it? And that's what we did. We deployed it in 2016 when the streetcar launched, and won an Edison Award in 2017 because of it.
Wow, that's interesting. It sounds like the public Wi-Fi and how that enabled systems and things like smart lighting and kiosks really was the foundation for all of that.
Correct. Yeah. So, the internet is, if you're going to have the Internet of Things, you got to have a way to connect all the things. And so that internet infrastructure became the way to connect all of the different things. And we also gave a way to have a business model because it allowed the not only the machines to have a way to connect to the things, but it allowed people to connect as well. And Wi-Fi increasingly, or internet increasingly, is the lifeblood of everything that we do, and that was just kind of a core piece of the infrastructure to be able to make everything work.
Your business home base is very similar. Can you talk a little bit about what your business does?
Yeah. So Homebase is a smart building platform. So we're a software and services business that focus first on apartments, multifamily buildings, but now moving into commercial and many other types of buildings that we spend over 90% of our time in, and we connect all of the things inside that building. So that's very nebulous, I know, but we start with access control or smart locks. You got to have a way to connect or get everybody in and out of the building. And then that internet infrastructure is something that we focus on heavily. You got to have a way to connect all the things inside the unit to provide a smart home experience for the resident, but you also have a way to connect all the other things throughout the rest of the building, like security cameras or amenity spaces, TVs, things like that. So same concept that we deployed the internet infrastructure throughout the smart city, we deployed internet infrastructure throughout the building itself. And that provides connectivity for all those devices, but it also provides a business model for property owners to own their internet infrastructure and sell access to the Wi-Fi network to the residents as an amenity.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes a way that they can pay for all of this smart technology that goes into the building, while also giving a really great living experience to the residents at a cheaper price than they would traditionally be getting internet at. And so we view it really as a kind of a win-win-win solution when you're trying to make your building smart early as an early adopter, and provides a way to connect all the things without having to have a bunch of like cellular hubs or extra hardware throughout the building that you don't need.
Let's go back to a term you used earlier, which is the Internet of Things.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, literally, it's connecting all of the things. You're a thing, your phone's a thing, your computer's a thing, your watch that you're wearing is a thing, the lock on your door that's connected to the internet now is a thing, the thermostat the thing. All of these things are getting connected so that you can control them via your phone or via your voice, but also so that data can be utilized to create new experiences for you, or new ways of frankly living that can enhance, improve, make cheaper for in a lot of different ways. And so we're really in the first pitch of the first inning, if you will, of where the Internet of Things as an industry is, I think. But what's exciting is it's being adopted, and now that it's being adopted, it's moving beyond just being able to control your thermostat with your phone and turn it off, and turn it on, turn the heat on or whatever. And it's becoming things like wearing a wearable on your watch or on your wrist and being able to have it detect when you've been sitting too long
Mm-hmm.
and just for you to move up. So really being functional and offering advice to you versus just being another tool.
Smart infrastructure is the first stepping stone. That needs to be put in place before anything else can be done. Once that's in place, Blake, I've heard you mention things like an all-in-one app to pay, in-home grocery delivery, and smart access. What other trends are you seeing using this technology?
Yeah, so you obviously have to. I mean, part of what we're doing is very real world. So you've got to have the infrastructure, you've got to have the things actually connected to the internet. Once they are, then it enables a lot of new things, as I was mentioning. So what you said, we're doing in-home grocery delivery. So once you are able to securely get the right people in and out of doors, in an apartment setting, we can get the residents who are supposed to be living there with their phone in and out of the building and in their apartment unit. But now we can allow residents to allow service providers into their building. And so we partner with Walmart here in Kansas City to test in-home grocery delivery. And this was a service that residents could sign up for, pay $20 a month, and they could get unlimited deliveries into their literally into their refrigerator. The Walmart driver would come and put the groceries into the refrigerator, and all of that. And we built technology via a Bluetooth SDK that Walmart put into their delivery driver app that securely got the driver into the building and into the unit when they were authorized to be able to do so. And they wore a body camera, so it was extra secure. People could watch it in real time, or can watch it in real time. It's still happening today. I actually had my last order last week, and watch this delivery happen. And this is like the tip of the iceberg of turning access control or turning smart locks into truly a service versus just a security. Which security is first and number one. But once you do that, it becomes more about keeping or getting the right people in versus keeping everyone out.
Wow, that's very futuristic. Especially you bring up the security element and adding, body cameras. It's definitely a paradigm shift. You usually think of smart access as a deterrent, and as you eloquently put it, it's letting the right people in.
It's definitely about letting the right people in, and I think that's where some exciting things, where it gets exciting, and you really are able to start creating new living experiences for residents or in a building. But also it affects how that building is managed now going forward. And as that happens, I truly believe we can make buildings not only more profitable, which is a great thing to hear for investors, but make them more affordable to be a resident or a tenant in those buildings at the same time. And I think that's where things are going to get really, really interesting, as we, as the technologies progress and we get kind of out of the chip shortages, the labor shortages, and everything else we have.
You bring up property management, and we've talked about this in-home grocery delivery. It sounds like we're progressing towards automation.
I mean, you nailed it. I mean, we ultimately what we're doing a lot with Homebase, but ultimately I think what we're doing is we're automating the management of buildings. We're automating the function of living in buildings for a lot of people too. And that's what the Internet of Things fundamentally enables, is the ability for that to happen. And it's because of data, but it's because of the real world functions of a physical lock, the bent metal and the smart lock and the smarts inside that bent metal to enable that.
Before we move on to work related things, what other applications of this technology do you see impacting our home life?
I mean, literally everything. It's everything from sustainability and making our homes more efficient to making them, more fun to live in. I think literally the possibilities are infinite. And like I said, we're at the very tip of the iceberg. Just right now, the work is being done still just to connect the things.
Again, laying that foundation. Now, you own your own business, you work with others and have people that work for you. How will the office be impacted by this technology? Are we just all going to be virtual? What's going on there?
I definitely don't think so. I definitely think the people that are sounding the alarm that the world's fully remote now and everything are people that are kind of missing the mark. I think that it's nearly impossible. I'll take that back. Like I will say that truly great things are built with people being in a room and people being able to collaborate and physically collaborating. And there's no doubt that incredible things can be created remote. Incredible things are being created remote. But I think that the future of work is going to be very hybrid. And I think it's truly going to test the limits of what people think of work-life balance, because I think the future of work is going to be very, sprint based. You might spend a bunch of time with your team members collaborating, working. You might work an 80-hour week, but that next week after you finish everything, it might be a very chill week. And you might be able to do that from that week from wherever you want, because you can go travel and spend it with your family the whole time. I really think that the future of work is going to be flexible. It's going to be collaborative, even more collaborative, and it's going to happen, kind of in pods, and people being able to meet up and do their work, and then or do the collaborative work, and then go on and do their individual contributor type work wherever they want.
Interesting. Next episode is episode 12. How is the news reported? And this is a really cool one because I got to talk to someone that I have seen a lot of, and a lot of them on the television. That's right. This episode featured a discussion with Haley Harrison over her career as a news anchor and journalist. Haley serves our community by reporting on stories as the evening anchor for KBC9 from 5 to 9 p.m. And Haley is a fellow podcaster. That's right. She's the creator and host of the KBC9 Storytellers podcast. Haley has done all sorts of stuff. She's interviewed documentary filmmaker Ken Burns, covered natural disasters like Hurricane Irene, done a lot of great work through being a news anchor and journalist covering stories within our community. And here I am getting to talk to them and ask them some really cool questions. For the artist for this episode, it was Carlton Rashad and his song, Good Love. Carlton is a fantastic R&B singer and songwriter from Kansas City, and he in fact won an award for Best Male Vocalist in Kansas City. Carlton has a lot of good music, and it's worth supporting him and his craft. He's a really down-to-earth person, and loved supporting Carlton here with his song Good Love. In this highlight, you'll hear the purpose of the news, the role of a news anchor, and we kind of go through finding stories in the process that they go through at KMBC9 on episode 12, How is the News Reported?
I just want to turn this house into a home. I'm not asking for much. Keep it 100, we can build up. Give affection and love, and stay committed to. I want that you stay on my mind. You stay on my mind. All the time. I want that good love, hey, good love, baby. I want that help me
as someone who has been, a consumer of news, who's obviously a participant that works in that industry, what do you think is the purpose of the news?
So the news has a lot of purposes. It's a very important thing. Of course, I would say that, right?
No, yeah, some slight bias here, but objectively.
Yeah, objectively, the news serves a lot of purposes, and I think first and foremost would be conveying important life-saving information in the event of an emergency or a crisis. Think
Okay.
about the crisis that we've been in for the last 2 years, the global pandemic. Conveying the most current information that we have, the most current science that we have, letting our viewers know about that so that they can make informed decisions about their health and safety and welfare every single day. That's one example. If there were a flood that hit Kansas City, people would need urgent information, moment by moment. They don't even want to wait for that information to get written into a web story and put online. They want to turn on their TVs and watch what's happening right now and get the very latest information. That's one great purpose that local news serves. Think about all of our government reporting and helping to contribute to an informed electorate. That is why freedom of the press is protected in the First Amendment. That is because it is essential to a healthy democracy so that our voters, people in our communities, can make good decisions when they go to the ballot box so that they know what their government's doing, so that we can hold government accountable for what they're doing. Those are just a couple of examples. And then, we include weather reporting every day so that people can, at the very least, dress themselves appropriately for the weather so that they can make plans for the next few days and how the weather impacts their lives there. We do traffic reporting so people know if they're going to get to work on time or if they need to find another route. We do sports reporting so people can follow their favorite sports teams. We do so much in the course of our newscasts, and all of it is very essential.
In summary, you got that dissemination of critical information. You have, say, a national emergency. You have that transparency, keeping, government accountable. And then you got some, as you mentioned, I may need a coat today. And also, what happened last night with Patrick Mahomes? Is the offense clicking? What's going on there?
And that's essential information, isn't it? To know what's happening with Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs. No, I mean, it absolutely is. And it's all, the bottom line is that we got to give good information to people that directly affects their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And no one really does that better than local news does. I mean, the national news, you'll find out things that are very important, things that are very important to our government on a large scale, important to our society and country and world on a large scale. But this sort of hyper local news is stuff that really does have a direct impact on just about everybody who watches in one way or another. And so, and again, I think nobody does that better than local broadcast news and local print news.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, specifically local news, because those topics aren't really being brought up nationally when proposition whatever is being voted on. How many other, outlets are talking about that?
There's not a lot, and not a lot of places that people can go to find out what is being debated at the local school board, or find out what the local COVID case rates are. And there's a lot of information out there on the internet where people can nowadays go to find that information. But who is curating that information? Who is doing independent reporting on that to make sure that that information is accurate and deciphering what's real, what's not? Who is sort of collecting all of that and putting it into a digestible form? There is, I think, yes, people can go get their own information nowadays, but it is such a big job to find out what's right, what's truthful, and what is the best source of information. And really, we do that for our viewers. We process it and digest it for them so that they don't have to do that.
Now, you brought up just then that you do that for your viewers. Now, in this grand purpose of the news, what is the role of a news anchor?
So, I can speak about our newsroom, and I've been in newsrooms that might be structured a little bit differently, but in our newsroom, the news anchors are really newsroom leaders. I don't have a managerial title by any means. I don't care to have one, but we are newsroom leaders in the sense that we are actively engaged in our editorial process and deciding what stories do we do today, how do we do them, and how do we tell them? What information do we include in those stories? The news gathering process in general, we're very actively involved in that. From the time I walk in the door, we have an editorial meeting every afternoon to sit down and look at, here's what's possible to do today as a story. What should we be doing? And why should we be doing that story? And we are part of those kind of vigorous debates that we have in the newsrooms. We are also in between newscasts. A lot of people think that I go on air for half an hour at a time and read the news and then I'm done. A lot of people ask me, do you go home in between newscasts? No, I do not. We are very busy in between newscasts, writing stories, helping collect news stories for our producers, and with our producers, working really closely in tandem with them to assemble the show, to work on the order of the stories in the show, and to really serve as sort of the final edit on a story, because we're sort of the last filter that a story goes through before it makes it onto the air. That story will make its way through reporters and producers in our newsroom, through editors, and then at very last, it goes through the anchor. And so we're very, very much involved in that process.
Wow, that's interesting. I want to get into the process a little bit later, but yeah, that is an excellent point. Like, by the time it gets to you guys, we're on air, right? And so you kind of need to vet, filter, and yeah, and you, believe it or not, you do stuff before you're on TV. You're not, it's just not your 30 minutes and you're done. How disappointing is that for you?
People sometimes must watch and think, did she prepare today? No, I did. We were working very hard, and sometimes things go awry. But yes, we are working very, very hard behind the scenes. And sometimes, the assembly of those stories comes up to the wire. And we're all working together to put them together, to make it happen, to select just the right words and the right combinations, and filtering information. What can we report? What can we not report at a certain point? What's accurate? What's not? There's so much that goes into putting together even just a 20-second story that I read, that quick. It can take us half an hour or more sometimes. And really those stories are an evolution throughout the day. Mm-hmm. We have newscasts starting at 4:30 in the morning, 4:35, 6, 7, 8, noon, 4 p.m., 5 p.m., 6 p.m., 9 p.m., 10 p.m., 11 newscasts throughout the course of our day, in addition to constantly updating our website. And so, once one newscast is over, we have a next deadline just a few hours away. So we've got to try to update as many of those stories as we can, including adding in new stories that are coming in from our reporters. It is just a constant battle, and it never stops all day long. And when I walk out of the newsroom at night, the crew for the next set of shows is already in working on the morning show.
Now, you talk about kind of the timely matter of, these stories as far as like when they're spoken about and how much you divulge. How do news outlets find out about news stories just in general?
There's a lot of ways that we find out about news stories. A lot of it is from sources, reporters, working sources, and having good communication with people who are in the know in our community. A lot of times stories will come to the news anchors, for example, because we are the most forward-facing people in the newsroom. There are dozens and dozens of people who are working behind the scenes to make a story happen. But most people, kind of get to know who we are because they see us every night in their living rooms, and that's wonderful. So a lot of people will send me story ideas and say, hey, did you see this? Did you hear about this? Why aren't you guys reporting about this? And those are things that I can then take to our team and present as well. Our reporters have their sources that they're working. In addition to all of this, we have a newsroom email, and people will just send our newsroom emails and say, check into this, please. Of course, the internet, a lot of stories come from the internet. For example, last night, we had a deputy who shot a man out near Blue Springs, and the sheriff posted about that shooting moments after it happened on Twitter. And in fact, that is where we learned about the shooting. Now, did we immediately report? Well, no, because we were behind the scenes making follow-up calls with dispatchers. We had a crew that we sent out to the scene. They were doing their own independent reporting and news gathering. And so there's a lot that happens behind the scenes to get those stories off the ground once we hear that something has happened.
You have this element of key sources that kind of reach out, that you can talk to about this. I would assume, say, government, you may have someone that has the scoop on that. And then you have kind of your, I almost want to say, your public facing. So you have people that, reach out to say, hey, I've seen Haley on the news, she's on Twitter, hey, has she thought about this? As well as, just reaching out directly to the news, you're saying their email.
Right. And through the course of the day, we may get, hundreds of story ideas submitted to us through all of those different means. And we have to decide, it's sort of this delicate balance of deciding what is urgent, what do people have to know about today, or what can we wait until tomorrow to tell people about, what is newsworthy, what's possible to dedicate resources to today, what story is possible to tell, or what story should we wait until later to tell. So, there's a lot of kind of calculus and factors that go into what ultimately does make it into our newscast based on all of those story idea submissions that we receive and filter.
Yeah, what makes a story newsworthy? Our most recent and last highlight for this episode is from episode 13, How Do You Handle Anxiety? Anxiety is a topic that a lot of people may be afraid to talk about, and a lot of people have on their minds whether they want to express it or not, and it's something that impacts everyone. So to have someone submit this question was very cool, being that it allowed me to talk about it. And the other thing is, it was a journey to find someone qualified enough to answer that question. And oddly enough, coming off of the last episode where we talked to a TV anchor and journalist, we ended up interviewing a former TV anchor and journalist, and that is Crystal Lampett, who's a former TV journalist turned licensed psychotherapist. And Crystal was a news anchor and journalist for KSHB TV, and she hosted the daily morning show Kansas City Live. She hosted Behind the Spot, and she reported from the sidelines for Sporting Kansas City. And Crystal has her own practice called CL Wellness, which you should definitely check out. Crystal, during this interview, if you couldn't tell, she is super empathetic, a deeply caring person, and I mean, she has the best vibes. she does. She has the best vibes, and she has a lot of training for all different kinds of therapies, whether that be eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or just cognitive behavioral therapy. She's trained and versed in a lot of different therapeutic techniques, and man, this is a really cool conversation, and she's again, highlight, just has the best vibes. For the artist for this episode, it is actually a band called Larson, and their song Good Looking Out. And man, the vocals on this track and the music is just very, very good. It is A1. And this is odd because this band, Larson, a friend of theirs reached out to me and basically said, hey, you should have these guys on your podcast. And I was like, all right. And I checked them out, and I was immediately hooked on this song, Good Looking Out. It's a great, great song. In this highlight, you will hear Crystal and I explain anxiety, some of the symptoms of anxiety, and where it comes from on episode 13, How Do You Handle Anxiety?
Like the mountains I climb for you. It's been so long that I can't recall exactly what I'm supposed to do with all these waves crashing on my shore. Captain, give me an order or two, 'cause I can't help but
Now,
Yeah.
for someone that has anxiety and maybe they don't have the best awareness.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how you might know if you have anxiety or not?
Yeah. So there's, there's anxiety, and then there's anxiety disorders. And some amount of anxiety is normal and healthy and important. And the way that I really see anxiety is it's truly a signal that our body is giving us. So rather than seeing it as, oh, that's something I shouldn't experience, or something that I have to battle or overcome or control, I really like to see anxiety as something we should listen to, something we need to pay attention to, because it's often alerting us to something important. And so, for example, like a typical anxiety experience might be, oh, I'm really anxious about taking this test.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's important information, that maybe
it's
you
an indicator.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's the check engine light going off on your car. You don't go, let me ignore that. You go, let me investigate this. And if you're feeling anxious about taking a test, yeah, that probably makes sense. It probably means that you really care about whatever it is you're going for. And that it's important, and that it, is bringing up some uncertainty for you. So what can we do to mitigate that? How can we help that? When it comes into, thinking of any disorder as a spectrum, and even the word disorder, I don't use a ton in my practice because I think it is unnecessarily pathologizing.
It has some weight to it.
It does, and it automatically makes you think something's wrong.
Yeah, there's a
you.
negative connotation when you say that, right?
Right. It kind of just has that sense of, heaviness, like I'm broken, I need to be fixed. When really, if we can see, your brain's number one job is to keep you alive. So if it's alerting you to some things, it's working, it's doing its job, and it's doing its job well. I understand the desire to maybe have less anxiety, and sometimes we get frustrated about the way that it's doing that, because if you think about like an anxiety disorder, one of the most common ones is generalized anxiety disorder, where you're anxious about many, many things. So the symptoms of this would be you're restless, you're on edge, you're worried about so many things, but they're not necessarily rational or impending. It's not just like, oh, I'm anxious because I have a test coming up.
It's a
like
heightened sense.
Constantly activated. Yes. And to get that diagnosis, you would be experiencing it more days than not for 6 months, at least 6 months. And if we can see that as, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. Like, why am I experiencing this? It's still less pathologizing than going, something's wrong with you. You have a disorder. So I do try to differentiate between, is this a typical amount of anxiety that most people would experience, or is it interfering with your life? And when we give it the label of a disorder, it's usually persistent and pervasive. So that's what we're looking for, is it's happening more days than not, and it's interfering with your ability to function in multiple areas of life. So maybe it's getting in the way of work. Maybe it's getting in the way of, socializing. Maybe it's making you isolate or shut yourself in because you're so afraid to be out in the world. So that would be like like an agoraphobia. So other ones, social anxiety, we have the specific phobias, like, people who are afraid of spiders or afraid of flying. So there's a separation anxiety as well, which is pretty common in kids and also can happen in adults, interestingly enough. But these are all sort of collectively under the anxiety umbrella. And I get it. No one wants to have like a panic episode in the middle of an exam, or, panic while they're driving. So I understand that there is some frustration with, thanks, brain, for doing your job, but could you do it in a nicer way? Yes. And we want to work with it. We want to understand, well, why is that coming up? Rather than going straight to, something's wrong with me, I'm broken. We usually want to get curious as to, what is it about this environment or this experience that is making me feel unsafe or uncomfortable? And we want to get curious about it. You're
approaching with a healthy level of skepticism, as opposed to negative kind of cloud, if you will. You brought up
curiosity,
a panic attack, like panic attacks. What are some symptoms of anxiety that people may experience?
Yeah, so if you have, so there's generalized anxiety, which is that broad strokes anxiety where you're worrying about things more days than not for at least 6 months. With a panic disorder, it's pretty common to have anxiety with a panic disorder as well. And a panic episode, if anyone has ever experienced one, sometimes it gets mistaken for a heart attack. So sometimes people end up in the ER thinking they're having a heart attack. And the reason why this is, and I like to do a lot of education on the way that the brain actually works. So if you're not watching this, I would definitely Google Dan Siegel's hand brain model. But sort of my rough iteration of it is, if we can think of this as the brain, and this top part is the cortex, the neocortex, which is where all of the rational thinking happens. So this is problem solving, this is compromise, this is diplomacy. This is the part of your brain you want to be using when you're making important
Your
decisions.
higher order thinking comes from there.
Exactly. Executive functioning, all that stuff happens up here. Underneath that, we have the middle part of the brain, the amygdala, which is in the limbic system. And it's much more emotional. And the amygdala is that smoke alarm. So the amygdala's number one job is to scan the environment for threats and to let you know whether you're safe or not. And if it detects a threat, and when I say threat or trigger, I don't mean just like a tiger. A threat could be a facial expression. You can feel threatened from somebody's facial expression or body language or a certain tone of voice. And especially if you have trauma, a trigger could be a smell. It could be a certain environment where something traumatic happened. So this is what I mean when I say, okay, if your brain, your amygdala detects that, it's going to flip your lid. So what essentially happens is the cortex goes offline and your amygdala starts sending signals down your brainstem to the rest of your body to fight or flight. And that's that fight or flight, where you notice your heart pounding, you might start sweating, you're going to notice, your major muscle groups are getting a lot more blood, because it's designed to help you stay alive. You are either supposed to fight the threat or flight from it. And if your brain decides neither of those are options, there's actually going to be another option, which is shut down or freeze. So it's kind of like playing possum, and these all have really important survival mechanisms attached to them, where if I play dead, if I play a possum, maybe the wolf will leave me alone. Maybe the predator will leave me alone. Or I get to dissociate so hard from my body that I won't feel it if I'm about to be eaten. So it's kind of a very primal animalistic part of the brain. But a lot of times that's what's getting triggered in a panic episode. So all of that to say, if something happens and I start panicking, you'll notice it really mirrors a lot of that fight or flight response. And so people think that like, oh, I'm just worrying about nothing, or I'm just over exaggerating. What's actually happening is your brain has detected a threat, or it's detected something that feels off, and it's sending you the signal that, hey, we need to check this out. And so when you notice those physiological responses, it's important to pay attention and to be curious about them, rather than just thinking of it as a mental or cognitive process, because it's really quite physiological and it's very physical.
It's all encompassing.
Your whole body, exactly. And anyone with anxiety or anyone with panic will tell you how much it impacts their entire body and nervous system. So that's why it can be quite debilitating, if you're trying to live your life and you're not understanding where these panic episodes are coming from. So it can be pretty frustrating to deal with, but I like to start with the perspective that, hey, this is your brain doing its job. And if you're alive right now, that's a sign that it has done its job pretty well your entire life. So can we at least acknowledge its attempts and its intentions, which is to keep you safe and to keep you alive?
Yeah. Now, you mentioned earlier kind of about finding the root cause for some of these things, and how that's like an epiphany, and how you can help people through that. Where in some instances does this anxiety come from for people? When that where's that coming from when it pops up on the dashboard, if you will?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you asked that, because if you look at anxiety, Anxiety looks a lot like the fight or flight response for many of us. Depression can look a lot like the freeze response. So they're actually physiological responses. You know, if you think of what depression is, for a lot of people, it's lack of motivation. They don't want to get up. They don't want to leave the couch. They can barely take care of themselves. They're not even doing the basic hygiene things. And so a lot of times these symptoms can be based in trauma. And so if you have unresolved trauma and you may not realize it, you could be getting triggered constantly into a state of anxiety or depression, but not be aware of it. And unfortunately, we don't always get to know exactly what the triggers are, because a lot of times trauma happens really, really early on, especially attachment trauma or relational trauma. So we're talking like the first 5 years of life, of which you're not going to have cognitive memory of. You're going to have that implicit memory or those body memories. So
you'll have those associations.
Yeah. And it's kind of a vague, you know, maybe it's a physical sensation, but there's no image or thought or memory attached to it. So the example that I use with clients is, you know, if you're a 2-year-old and you're exploring the world as 2-year-olds do, and you touch a hot stove, your body's going to go, oh, don't do that. That was painful. That was hot. We should not do that in the future. And so you'll have kind of a sensation, you know, somatic memory of that, but you won't necessarily remember being 2 years old and that happening. So trauma, the way that I like to think of trauma is, yes, there is the shock trauma of PTSD, right? Which is usually a singular, like pretty extreme traumatic event, you know, going to war, getting in a car accident, those types of things. But there are also subtler traumas. And if we can think of trauma, not so much just as PTSD, but if we can think of trauma as anything that is too much, too fast, too soon, that overwhelms our coping capacities, or not enough, which also overwhelms our coping capacities. So things like neglect, things like abuse, even emotional abandonment, chronic emotional abandonment. These are things that, depending on your nervous system, which is influenced by your biology, depending on your nervous system, it can manifest as trauma. It can be experienced as trauma. And so we don't always know what it's from. Some people come into my office and they know exactly, you know, they have a pretty good idea. Like, well, when I was a kid, I was in foster care, I had abusive parents, I went through X, Y, and Z. I work with a lot of sexual trauma, you know, so some people have a pretty clear idea of where it's stemming from. And so we want to track that and look at, okay, what flashbacks are coming up? You know, is it a body flashback? Is it an emotional flashback? Are you feeling like you are back there at the event and it's happening all over again when you have these panic episodes, for example? Other people don't necessarily have such a clear idea. And the good news is you don't have to. You don't have to remember every single thing. You don't have to know exactly what happened to you to be able to heal from it.
That's super interesting, especially just kind of how you just form that. And it's not, you may not be able to crystallize it, you know?
Yeah. It is kind of unique the way the brain works.
Yeah. I mean, it hijacks you at certain points, albeit you may not like that.
Yeah. Yes, this is true.
And this concludes the episodes 1 through 13 highlights. This has been a nostalgic trip, going back and listening to all these and editing all the music. It's been a really fun time, and your participation, whether that be listening to the podcast episodes or submitting questions, is greatly appreciated. And the same goes for all of the guests and musicians that have been on. It has been awesome to see what Kansas City has to offer, and really cool to see them be so supportive of this platform and willing to share their content, their music, and their voice. I'm looking forward to see where this platform goes in the future. Now, I highly encourage you to go support all of the guests, all of the artists and bands, and follow the Simple Questions podcast on your preferred platform. Go check out the show notes on simplequestionspodcast.com to get a little more information. And as always, keep asking questions.